Shalom, shalom, friends, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. I want to thank you all for being here with us today for what is going to be a open mic discussion. Actually, it's an after show from the modern day debate that we just saw end about an hour ago, actually, between Randall Rauser and John Loftus. I did just notice that I forgot to drop the link in the live, or in the description rather. So I'm going to go ahead and drop that in the live chat now. It is an open room, so anybody is free to join. There is a couple rules here, one of which is that me or somebody who is in the room does have to know who you are, as well as rules about, over talking people, staying on the subject, not insulting and cussing at people and so on. And of course, we do want to give priority to people who want to actually discuss the subject matter of the debate or the debate itself, which was the subject matter was actually so let me actually describe the debate first, because I guess that would probably be important, right? So most of you were probably here because of this debate. It was between Randall Rauser and John Loftus. Right, again, that is Randall Rauser and John Loftus. So for those of you who don't know, Randall Rauser is a internet apologist who commonly goes by the name Tentative Apologist. And John Loftus is a Christian, or excuse me, not a Christian, a former Christian and current atheist speaker and polemicist, as well as Jesus mythicist. And he was the one who was taking the atheist side in this particular position. The discussion that they were actually having was whether or not God's ethics were just. It was actually titled God of Genocide, but seemingly what they ended up talking about a lot was, general atrocious things that were quote unquote atrocious things that were associated with killing in general, not necessarily the ones that were considered what we might consider a genocide today or something along those lines. I'll give my thoughts here on the debate real quick while we wait for anybody who wants to potentially join. I was not particularly impressed with the Christian side, if I'm being honest with you. I mean no disrespect to Randall Rauser. However, I have serious disagreements with his methodology and with what he supports. I think it is egregious, to be honest with you, how many times I heard him say the sentence, the historicity about that is questioned, or we need to dehistoricize that, or that's actually metaphor, or some, different variation of that. And it was incredibly disheartening, in my personal opinion, considering the fact that this man is supposed to be a Christian apologist defending the Christian side, and he doesn't even believe that the overwhelming majority of the texts in the Bible have any historical backing to them. He said plainly that he felt that the Joshua account was not historical, saying that it was anywhere from 300 to 700 years after the fact. He said that the Moses incident, or the Moses story rather, was largely ahistorical, saying, at least in particular, that the death of the firstborn was not historical. He said that the Genesis narrative from Adam all the way down to Noah was ahistorical, or at best only lightly historical, and it just so on and so forth, basically, right? And I have a problem with that. Personally, I have an absolute problem with that. In my view, once we start going down that path, I start to question why you even consider yourself to be a Christian. I start to question why it is that you believe anything in these stories if you won't believe those stories, right? Like, so for example, the resurrection of Jesus, right? Well, the resurrection is obviously something that is supernatural. It's obviously something that's miraculous. It's obviously something that you would see in myth or fiction because it's something that is extraordinary, supernatural, so on and so forth, right? We believe that that particular awesome and extraordinary event did occur in history as Christians, right? But if we're going to start making the claim, well, everything else that we have here in the Bible that appears to be miraculous or that we don't otherwise like is in some way dehistoricized, right? Then what's to say that this particular event isn't also a metaphor, an allegory, a fable, a parable, and in some way dehistoricized, right? What is the logic here for defending one supernatural event and supporting one supernatural event and believing in one supernatural event, right? And disregarding another as metaphor, as poetry, as whatever you decide to disregard it as. I had a problem with that. I had a really, really big problem with that. And I had a problem with his definition of inerrancy too. I have to say, he said that he believed that the Bible was inerrant in that it was providing a cohesive, non-contradictory message throughout, right? And that the message could be easily understood throughout. And I don't disbelieve that that is true about the Bible. However, that's not inerrancy under anybody's definition except Randall Rauser's. Inerrancy is the doctrine that in all instances where the Bible claims to be historical, claims to be speaking of doctrine, claims to be taking some level of affirmative, that is true. That the Bible is not in error, right? That the Bible, whether it's in regards to kinds producing their own kinds, or Joshua physically conquering the promised land, or whether or not Jesus is God, right? Those are obviously doctrinal, science, historical. Doesn't matter. The doctrine of inerrancy would state that all of those things are true because the Bible says that those things are true. It does not say that something is simply consistent, right? And I made the comment during the debate, if that is all we mean, that something is internally consistent and that it has an internally consistent message throughout by the phrase inerrancy, well, then Lord of the Rings is inerrant. Star Wars is inerrant. Infinity War is inerrant. A lot of these stories have very clear messages, and they are very clearly laid out throughout the different iterations and reiterations of the story, the different sequels, prequels, so on and so forth, spinoffs and everything else, right? Are we going to start claiming that those things are inerrant? Is that all we mean by inerrant? Because that's not what I mean by inerrant. That's not what anybody else that I know of is claiming by inerrant. And so I had an issue with that. By the way, I see we do have somebody here in the back of the room, Converse Contender. Shalom, and thank you for being with us. I'll come to you in just a moment. I just want to quickly finish my rant because, unfortunately, I've been ranting so long on Randall that I haven't actually said anything about John. I think John Loftus is kind of a interesting person, but I've never been particularly impressed with him as a debater, if I'm being honest. And I find a lot of his reasons to be emotional appeal. Like, for example, when he goes on his list of why couldn't the 10 Commandments be what I say they are, I just don't see any reason to take that as a serious argument. I guess it's like, well, I don't know. Why aren't they what you said? Because you're not God, frankly. If you have a problem with them, that sounds like it's more your problem, I guess. It's almost, to me, if I could give an analogy, because I'm not doing a good job explaining it. If I could give an analogy, it would almost be like, saying like, I think the laws are illegitimate or cruel because they're not what I want them to be, right? Which I think would be kind of ridiculous reasoning. The laws are either illegitimate or cruel because they violate certain ethical norms and mores, not because they have some sort of a contradiction with what you would personally want if you were the person making the laws, right? And it seems like most of his argumentation is kind of on that level. But unfortunately, I didn't find Randall to be a particularly strong opponent. And so that's my opinions on the debate. But with that, I want to pass it on to Converse Contender. Thank you for joining today, and shalom.
Hey, what's going on? You doing all right?
Yeah, I'm doing very well, thank you. How you doing?
Oh, great. You can hear me fine, I guess?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, cool. Let's see if I can do this. This is my take real quick. Not sure if this is going to show up right or not, but we'll see. Oh, there we go. That's my take.
Rauser did better. So
Rauser did better.
Yeah, but not. I noticed. No, you don't necessarily say good, right? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
So, well, I mean, here's the thing. Sorry about all the noise.
Oh, you're good.
So, I like Randall, and I, you know that I've been in. I've had him on my team in a tag team debate, and then I've spoken to him privately as well,
Right.
just off air, and so I like him, and we've discussed a lot of different things, and I think that he's got a good take on a lot of his theology. I do think though that he is. I agree with you on some of the points that he is a little far. You might say left on or something like that. So just keep in mind that Rauser doesn't say that everything is that sounds miraculous or something like that is not historical, because he accepts the resurrection. He even makes arguments in his books about miraculous things that occur that he still thinks they're historical and that they're rational to believe in. But I do agree with you on some of the other things, like the conquest narratives and so forth. I think that he shouldn't take the route that he does on those. I wouldn't say, because it's just it just seems like he's giving. I don't know. So I'm sorry that I'm trying to put together my words correctly, because I know that Randall is a smart guy, and I don't want to just skim over what might be his belief, and But anyway, so I'll just say that Rauser, he should be more open to his modern intuitions being incorrect than that these conquests weren't condoned by God or something like that, right? So that's how it started off. Yeah, it's just that I think that he did better, and he could have done better, I think. And then I've got a lot to say about Loftus, but yeah, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that I think there's a good deal of the truth to what you're saying too. I personally, and I fully grant that I am particularly fundamentalist. I even usually tell people that beforehand, just so they're not caught off guard or anything like that. So if I were to have a conversation with Randall, perhaps he might say that there would be a certain level of bias on my side in the way that I interpret, and I guess to an extent that's true. But I do think that even just taking the conquest narrative alone, right? Not taking major events like the Exodus or the creation, right? But just the conquest, which is a major event, right? But it's not celebrated by a holiday like the Passover is, or the actual creation of all that exists, like creation claims to be, or something like that, right? And just in that, just in dehistoricizing that, you effectively turn God into a liar, in my view, right? Because you make it to where his promises to his people are null and void, or at best fictional, meaning he didn't really ever have to keep the promise in the first place because he was promising it to a non-existent person. I guess I don't know his view of the Abrahamic covenant in particular, right? But that would almost seem to me to be the best view, is that it was all fiction or parable or something like that. Because if there is a real promise and they don't actually come and conquer the land and enact God's judgment on these 7 nations and all that, then God's promise is just not fulfilled, right? And then at that point, I would then start to question, okay, well then what about his promises to me? Because if those ones weren't fulfilled, and those were immediate promises, right? I mean, my promises are more than likely not going to come till after death. right? So what faith should I have if Joshua couldn't even have faith, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I don't take the argumentation that Randall does, but it's just like that's part of the problems, I guess, that I feel like I see, when you start to dehistoricize certain elements of the Bible. And I even fully grant, people say it's symbolic of stuff. Completely agree. I often term the Old Testament as the living parable, right? Meaning that it did really happen, but also we are meant to look at it as if we were looking at a parable, to glean, right, what God is trying to teach us through these stories. But it's a lot, it's similar to, and I'll wrap up with this so I could pass on and not rant too much. It's similar to C.S. Lewis's idea of the true myth, right?
Yeah, the myth that was true, right? Yeah.
Exactly, right? Because it's not, when C.S. Lewis calls the Bible the true myth, he's not saying that it's that it didn't happen or that it's legendary or anything like that. He's saying everything that myths do, the Bible does, but for real. And I would say the Old Testament is the same way in that, it's everything that parables do, the Old Testament is doing, but for real. And that's what I think distinguishes it from, the Epic of Gilgamesh or something along those lines. But I'll go ahead and pass it back again.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I have a similar take, but not the same take, obviously. A couple things. One would be that I would say that all myths, from my perspective, and I think from the biblical perspective, would be based off of what's true. And so in that way, it depends on how you define a myth, right? But if you just mean like the stories that use supernatural characters or something, then all scriptures are going to be, because you have to you know that probably that there are multiple definitions of myth, and like one is a story that's not actually historically accurate or true, and the other is that a story that has supernatural characters. And that's kind of crazy because the margin, the room for equivocation on those terms is tremendous. And so it's there are like 50 other terms that I could say the same thing about. But I guess what I would say is that I think that all the other myths use the true archetype as kind of like a perversion or an idolatry of the true, archetype. And so in that case, I don't think it would be like what C.S. Lewis called the myth that was true, but rather just, like the truth or whatever. You see what I'm saying? So, but maybe it depends on how you define myth. And then the second thing would be, you called yourself a fundamentalist, and I would probably say I'm a fundamentalist, but we probably wouldn't mean it in the same way, right? Because that's another one of those terms that like has multiple meanings, of course, because like Kent Hovind would call himself a fundamentalist, and John Walton might call himself a fundamentalist, and they would disagree so far. And John Walton would probably say something about, well, I would think that Kent Hovind's more like a North American fundamentalist or something like that, or a Western fundamentalist, because he kind of prefers or endorses the traditions of the Western Church more so than the ancient Near Eastern like context, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I know there's probably going to be some disagreement there, but I think you could probably agree with me that it's going to depend on what we mean by it, because yeah. So I don't know if you want to respond to any of that before we move forward, but
yeah, definitely. And so, and real quick, I just want to say shalom to Jamie. I'll go ahead and pass it to you real quick after I respond here. Thanks for joining us. So I definitely hear you as far as the distinction here. Oh, he just dropped out too. That's he'll be back. We tend to have internet problems, but nonetheless, so I would say I think a couple things on that. So the first thing is that I definitely hear you in the need for distinction and specification in terms, for more than one reason. Actually, the first reason being that I do believe that When a myth or a legend is grounded in a culture's historical reality, meaning what they have penned down as their own history, I think it is more likely that the figures involved did exist than did not exist, and that there's some level of truth or kernel of truth to that. So to give an example as to what I mean, I think that it is more likely that Heracles, or Hercules, as people would probably more know him, I think it's more likely that he did exist in some way than that he did not exist, because the Greeks seemingly paint him in his myths and legends as if he did exist. Whereas figures like Zeus and Ares and other figures are detached, right? They're up on Olympus in the heavens doing God stuff. And I think that there can be problems with deducing that are very specific to each individual myth. So like, for example, I'll give actually 3 examples to give the levels, right? I believe that the Jesus story happened exactly as told. I believe that the Hannibal story is almost exactly as told, right? But probably with some myth and legend added in, right? And of course, here we're at 2 figures who are not necessarily considered to be ahistorical or strictly mythological, right? Then you start to take figures who are a little bit more questionable, like, say, Emperor Jimmu of Egypt, or for a long time, Imhotep, although we have found a statue with his name on it now. And figures like that, right? I think that they would, the stories we have about them would probably be mostly true, but with certain levels of embellishment. And then you have figures like Santa Claus, right? Where it's like the figure who this is originally based on does exist, but it's going to be really hard to find that kernel of truth, because the myth is almost a completely different figure at this point. And I suspect Hercules is probably in that category.
Yeah. One more thing here is that I pretty much agree with you, but I would say, honestly, Angel says I sound tired. I'm not tired. I was trying to choose my words carefully, because I just don't want to say anything that, I just don't want to say anything stupid. But anyway, but what I would make a distinction there is that I think that, so for example, John Walton, I've been reading his stuff for a long time, but I'm specifically way more this week because I'm having him on Friday. And so if you take, like, for example, let's talk about Adam, right? A historical person or not, okay? If I were talking to Kent Hovind, he would say, or any traditionalist, even myself, like a year or so ago, I would have said, like, well, of course, he was a real person, and I still think that Adam was a real person. But the difference is that John Walton and others, not just him, but they put it in more of a Adam. There was a person, Adam, right? But Adam is also used in archetypal language, because you can see where it expands from just talking about one person to talking about people as a whole, like when Paul uses it or something, and in other places. But so it's used as you could say, like an archetype of all people or something like that. But it's also used in a singular of a person. So while we might say, yeah, Adam was a person, but the text is also talking about an archetypal person, like, the beginning of what we know as people or something like that, right? And then maybe like just take a passage like man was made from the dust of the earth, right? You might take that and and you might take that and say something like, well, yeah, so that means that God took like clay in his hand and like made a person and blew into it or whatever. The problem is, like, the word for clay isn't there. There is a word for clay, but that is specifically the word for dust. And the second thing is, like, when that term is used in the passage, it tells us what it means, because it says, man was made from the dust of the earth, and to dust he shall return, and that it's referring to his mortality. And then when you read other cultures' texts from that same area, the dust reference means the same thing, mortality. So then, but when Walton writes a book saying that, well, dust doesn't mean that God sculpted a clay figurine in like blue, it's just saying that man is mortal. And then what we call fundamentalists look at him and say, oh, so he's this like new liberal scholar who's like changing, when really he's just thinking like, well, hang on a second. I want to see what they were actually indicating in what they wanted us to understand from it, not because while it was written for us, it wasn't written by us. So our presuppositions are, different, obviously. So that's just kind of like a thing I thought would kind of make for a good conversation,
Did you mean for us to us?
What was that?
What did you say about? I think you might have misspoke when you said it's for us, but not. You said by us or something.
Oh, okay, yeah.
What did you mean? You mean like it's not written to us, but it's for us? Is that the?
Well, yeah, but yeah. So it's not written to us, but it's written for us. But it's also not written by us, right? So the cultural aspect, yeah.
I see. Sorry.
Yeah, there is a phrase, you're right, that a lot of people use, like Heiser and Walton, that's like, it's not written to us, but it was written for us.
I agree with that. I agree. Yeah. You have to take their context first, or you're going to miss it.
Well, all I'm saying is that I was just making the distinction that if you say, I'm sticking to the text, what it says, so I'm not going to try and extrapolate for evolution or any of that stuff, right? I'm going to read the text, what it says in my English translation, and I'm going to, take what it says or whatever. And I was just pointing out, though, that if the original reader or writer wouldn't have understood it that way or meant it that way, then I'm just saying, like, who's the fundamentalist? Is it the one who takes more of a Western kind of approach to it, or modern, or is it the person who like understands like all of the cultures of the time? It's just like that interview I did with Dr. Falk. It's so much like his book was so much like Walton's work because it was about the origins of the Ark of the Covenant. And if you just like a modern Western reader, you might just think they just kind of made up that there was a box and that had wings on it and that had poles under it and all this stuff. But they lived in Egypt for 430 years or something. And so, of course, they're using some of the same ideas, but they use polemics to fight against those people, saying well, they were doing almost the right thing, but they were doing it wrong. And that's why they had the wrong God or whatever, And so anyway, I just say all that to say that the point about fundamentalism is that it just depends on what you mean by it. And I think that I think you guys would pretty much agree. I mean, but feel free to disagree with me. Obviously, I wouldn't be hurt by it or anything.
Well, so there's a couple things that I would want to kind of briefly say. So first thing, I do want to just address this comment real quick. Ankamesh Bros says Enuma Elish equals myth, Gilgamesh equals legend. Agree. And I think that's a perfect example of exactly what I'm talking about, right? Enuma Elish is separated from history, and that it's like this, it's what the gods are doing up there in the gods' realm, right? Whereas Gilgamesh, even if it's very highly embellished, the Sumerians are claiming that's taking place here with a historical figure who we actually do know from another source, namely the Sumerian Kings list. And so there's probably some level of truth to the Gilgamesh story, even though obviously a lot of it would be embellished. One of the truths being specifically that Gilgamesh was a king in Sumer. But nonetheless, I think that it is important to distinguish, I think, a couple things there, right? Because there is, myth in the sense of what the gods do, right? And I think that is really what, although it encapsulates legend also, I think that's really what C.S. Lewis means by the true myth. Right? Myth explains what are we doing here and why are we here and where are we going and what's the ultimate purpose of life and why are there cultures and all this kind of stuff. And the Bible does it, but for real, I think is sort of his point with that. But I also do think there is a level of even historical distinction there in that, right? So for example, the Iliad, right? I think the Iliad is actually probably largely true. I think Achilles was probably a real person. In fact, we know that was a common name from the time, and that it existed on the Ionian coast. Agamemnon was probably a real person. The Trojan War probably did happen, take about 10 years, and it may have even potentially been launched, at least propagandistically, over Helen of Troy. I don't necessarily dispute that, or Helen of Sparta, right? And yet, of course, there's obviously going to be certain levels of exaggeration in there even as well, right? Like, did the Odyssey happen? Probably not. Did the Trojan horse happen? Yeah, that's unlikely. Did Ares come down and Athena and all them and have any involvement? Almost definitely no, from a historical perspective, and from a Christian perspective, I could say definitely no, right? But the Bible's different in that I actually take in the true myth sense, right? In that I actually take every single thing that it says to be historical to actually have happened. So, like, for example, when the Bible talks about the soldiers marching around Jericho, right? That if that happens in any other myth, and I'm just being honest with the presupposition that I have here, but I think it's fair, right? If that happens in any other myth, even though I might grant the myth is based in some level of a discernible reality, I still would not probably grant that occurred. But since it happened in the Bible, I think I think we can have rest assurance that it is confirmed, right? And then because the Bible is a true myth, right? It's not a partially true myth or a partially true legendary account, but it's actually like what all these other cultures are doing, but the for real version, right?
Yeah, but you're using the term myth, right? In the way that it just has supernatural characters.
Well,
right?
both, right? Because there's the Enuma Elish, Mount Olympus creation style, right? True myth, which you see in Genesis and with the angels and all that kind of stuff, right? And that's God giving us the true mythological stuff, right? In the sense that it's apart from us with the gods. But we also see the true legendary accounts, right?
I just meant like you're not using myth in the way. So a lot of people use myth as in like how Mythbusters is like, oh, a lot of people believe this, but it's actually a myth, meaning not true.
Yeah, not
You're
like
using
that. Not
it
like
the
that.
other way, meaning that it's an old tale that has supernatural characters, and you're saying that in that way, this one is true where the other ones wouldn't be.
Yeah, this one is not only just true, but totally true, whereas the other ones are either not true at all in the case of their more esoteric and godly myth, right? Or,
and I agree with you about Jericho and like those other things. Like I find the majority of stuff, like if it claims to be historical, I pretty much accept it. So, yeah.
And then, so with that kind of an understanding, then that would give us a good jump to the understanding of fundamentalists, right? So I would say a fundamentalist means more than likely, if depending on the person you're talking to, it means one of two things, if not both things. The first thing is just the straightforward dictionary definition of the word fundamentalist, which is one who adheres to the fundamentals of a certain ideology or creed. Under that definition, there is no reason why Old Earth and Young Earth aren't both fundamentalists, because it's a tertiary issue, right?
Right. That was kind of what I was pointing out with Walton's view.
Yeah, and so while I would certainly be in the literalist camp, and I'll distinguish with the word literalist for a moment because of the fact that we want to make this distinction. Literalism is not necessarily fundamentalism unless that literalism is required for a fundamental in doctrine, right? So for example, when you've seen me, you've seen the Father, right? There is a literalness to that if you do away with, even though it's not hyper literalistic, right? Obviously no man has ever seen God, right? John, 1:14, or 1:18. But if we completely deliteralize it, right, then that would obviously be problematic, right? And so if somebody were to take a illiteral view of that phrase and say Jesus is not actually God, and that he's not God here in the flesh, or the equivalent of God here in the flesh, as you might say, from a more specifically technical Trinitarian view or something like that, that would be problematic, right? But if we're taking a non-literalistic view and something that is not necessarily fundamental like that, then I don't think it violates your right to be considered a fundamentalist per se. That being said,
go ahead.
Sorry. I would say that there is I believe there is a certain inconsistency in illiteral fundamentalism. And I believe that that's a dispute amongst brothers, don't get me wrong. And I would even consider it to be brothers, not just in Christ, but in fundamentalism, right? I would consider somebody like Hugh Ross, for example, to be a fundamentalist. But I would consider him to be an inconsistent fundamentalist, whereas I might consider somebody, at least on this particular issue, like a Ken Ham or Kent Hovind, to be a more consistent fundamentalist. My reason being that I think, and this is something I heard Jason Lyle, who's a young Earth astrophysicist, and he was doing an interview in the Gospel Truth, and so something he said is the Bible needs to be interpreted not necessarily literally, although where it intends to be taken literally, it should be, but literarily, meaning whatever is trying to be communicated by the authors. And to give an example that everybody in politics today knows of, we have this dispute about progressivism versus originalism on the Constitution, right? It's the same sort of idea, that originalist idea. What is the author's intent? And, you know, obviously a psalm, for example, because it's a poem by definition, isn't going to be taken as literally as a historical narrative in the Chronicles, right? But if we interpret the Bible in that literary fashion, Genesis presents as very straightforward history. And so while I wouldn't say that you are revoked of your Christian or even of your fundamentalist card by not necessarily being young Earth or something along those lines, right? I would say that I think that that's an inconsistent fundamentalism. And then, you know, if any of you guys have any comments on that, I'll go ahead and yield because I've been ranting for a minute.
Sorry.
I was just passing it on.
Did you want to say something before me?
Go ahead,
Jamie.
Please go first.
What was that?
Please go first.
Okay, yeah. So I was just gonna say that, like, so I guess that's gonna be where we disagree a little bit. I mean, like Walton, he's gonna say, and I pretty much take his view, although I may disagree with him on some things. He's gonna say that forget the young Earth, old Earth. Genesis is talking about. Oh, we lost our guy.
That's weird. How are we still here then?
he sometimes that you can drop out if, like, when I have my camera plugged up and I like accidentally knock it out, it does that sometimes.
You can probably still hear us. I don't know.
Yeah, sorry about that. I just had a small jump out there. Small internet problem. Continue. My apologies.
Yeah, not a problem. Yeah, so like, I agree with what you said, that it's about the author's original intent, right? So, but this is where Walton's going to argue that the book of Genesis isn't talking about science at all. So no young Earth or old Earth creationists are going to get what they want out of Genesis, because he says the problem is, like, if you read his book, he gives props to both sides. He gives props to the old Earth creationists by saying, like, hey, look, good job. I see what you're doing. You see modern science. You're like, hey, look, we're losing a lot of kids. We're losing a lot of people because they're just told in their churches, like, just stick to what we're telling you, and it'll, everything's going to be fine. Like, this is the truth, and don't worry about observations of the world and things like that. Where, but of course, there's a lot of really bright young Earth creationists. That's why he gives them props, and he goes, listen, I agree with you guys. Yom and Genesis is a 24-hour period. And so he starts giving credit, but then he says, the problem is that this matches directly with the temple inauguration in the Bible and in other cultures of their time. The temple inauguration was everything. The lampstands in the temple, let there be light, and like the days of creation and God resting. It's like the whole point of God resting, and the Ark of the Covenant was his footstool. All Genesis was about God ordering everything in the way that it should function, so that then he sits back and operates. And he compares it to, like, you know, if you're living out of boxes because you just moved, you know, it sucks because you're like, it's like,
Tell me about it.
where's that book I wanted, you know, or where's that thing that I was looking for? But he's like, after you have your refrigerator set up and your other stuff set up, now you can rest from like ordering and like get to work or whatever on your computer or whatever. Anyway, so he's going to argue throughout the whole text of Scripture first to show it from Scripture that this isn't trying to indicate science, but we're trying to read that in from a modern audience because it's important to us. But they didn't even have the concept that we have. They didn't even think of supernatural as being a thing that was besides nature. They just thought of supernatural as being like, well, yeah, God's causing everything at every time. So like there is no natural supernatural. Everything is being caused by God. You know, so anyway, he's just saying like that's what we have to be careful of in these texts. So like he's going to accept everything else. He's just going to say that like when we have evidence that of what they are saying in their time, something that can add context, we should you know, take that into consideration. And then of course he goes in and breaks down all the words in Genesis to like, what does it mean? Of course, you know. So like the word rib, you know, like woman was made from man's rib, and he's like, yeah, so let's look at all the other passages where that word translated rib is used for an anatomical body part. Oh, this is the only place it's used for that. You know, so anyway, that's just kind of like a
side, right?
Get the conversation started. But like yeah, and I think of course he could be wrong about some of those things, right? But there are a lot of good points to be made, and you know, and then if you guys want at some point, we can get to like what Loftus argued. But go ahead, sorry.
All right.
So,
Sorry.
go ahead, actually, Jimmy, because I've been taking.
No, it's your show, buddy. I have so many. I'll try to. This is good practice for me because I have so much I'd want to say about that. Like, so much I agree with, and then something I just wanted to bring up about what you're saying, about what what's his name again? The scholar you're talking about, Walton.
Oh,
so
John Walton, yeah.
Yeah, like I think a lot of his points are like really salient, like they're just true. But at the same time, and this is something that came up in my mind earlier. The problem I always like, I'm really open to some of the people that are like more old earth, their view, and like some of their insights have been really helpful to me. And like just not ignoring them, you know, and having to wrestle with the text and deal with it and be honest about it. It does seem like scholars are always saying this, and it seems like whenever something seems to be right, it's a both and thing. And so my problem with some of the application of the ancient Near East is, and it's just an obvious just fact that you have to look at that if you want full context. And I try to be open to that. I am open to that. But for instance, you're saying about, and I'm open to the polemical idea that clearly is a thing. It's just you can't deny it. But the problem I have is if we see like, for instance, in the ancient Near East, we see things like where God's resting, and we see them, and we start looking at it as polemical, or a polemic, or however you would say it. So what do you do with the idea, though, that like parts of the text in Genesis creation seem to me to be like correlated to history, like the biblical narrative history, like the things he makes on the days have like a loose correlation to like the major events, to such a degree that if you look at it closely, it's like, you know, and that's the other thing I was going to say too, is like, so if he's copying from them, like how much is being copied? Or if you take an old earth view, how do we know, or I should say, if it's a young earth, then it might make sense that other cultures have similar stories with slight different details, because they're actually telling the same story with mistakes in it. Now, on an old earth view, that seems like it wouldn't work, or it would be less likely to be that to be the case, that it's the direct story, just with details changed, I guess. I mean, don't the old earth people kind of argue that these cultures are like way older than the Hebrew culture, and so it doesn't really make sense to fit with the biblical narrative if they're changing the.
No, well,
How does
not
that work?
yeah, no, not necessarily, right? Because like the Hebrews, of course you know this, but like some people act like the Hebrews just grew out of the ground, like they were just replanting the earth, and the other cultures were like you know, already there or whatever. But like the Hebrews came out of these cultures, right? Abraham came out of Mesopotamia, right? He lived in Canaan. He was an Amorite. The Hebrews were Amorites, and then they lived in Egypt for like 400 and something years, and then they came out with a mixed multitude of people, Libyans and Nubians and all these groups, right? And then they all took the covenant together. And if you look at the covenant, just for another example, the covenant that they take is in the exact same structure as the suzerain and vassal covenant or treaty that's used by all the other nations that surround them. It's the same structure. So it's basically, you know, the suzerain is the like governing power that's going to like assume power over you and protect you, and you're going to like give them a like you're basically you'll submit to them and they'll govern over you and like protect you or whatever. And
Right.
that's exactly what they were doing with God. Is they were like, hey, look, let us make a covenant with you or whatever, and you know you'll protect us and we'll submit to you and your rules or whatever. And so, but also the structure of the agreement was the same throughout the ancient world. So like, yeah, but I wouldn't say that the other cultures came before them. They came out of these cultures. It'd be
Yeah,
like
that's true.
how we live in, well, I live at least in America. It's like your ancestors living in America for 300 something years, and then you go out to a different land and people are like, well, yeah, he's borrowing from the Americans or whatever. What? I was an American. I came
Right.
out of this culture, you know. So God
It's not
relates
really
things
that's
to
not a
the,
problem, I guess. What I was suggesting.
yeah, I understand what you're
What
saying,
you were
but
saying about what the last thing I wanted to say or ask you guys about. Let me think. You know, when we were talking, and I think Nicholas was there, CJ, and he was. I felt like nobody was understanding. I think you guys were both there, actually, if I recall. Maybe you weren't, Converse. Actually, I can't remember which one it was, but he was saying, and I just absolutely agreed with him. And it sounded like you were kind of maybe agreeing, Converse, in what you're saying, unless I misunderstood you. But it's dumb to try to argue that the days of creation weren't meant to be literal days, like in the context, at least, like if you want to like interpret that a certain way, for it's like the true historical meaning of it or something, it's not literal days, then fine. But like to pretend like it might mean not a regular day. I mean, it seems like the text, the context, and the you know, the pointers of the context, it's saying it in the terms of meaning a regular day. It's just a question of what part of that is historically the case. You know what I mean? It's like just people seem to want to like deny that it intended to say a regular day. It just seems obvious to me that, you know, maybe that's
yeah,
not historically right, but it's intended to say that. In other words, sorry.
yeah. John Walton was a young Earth creationist for over 20 years. He admits in his book. No, the word yom there, yeah, of course it can mean other things, but in that passage, it doesn't mean other things. It means a 24-hour period. And so, but what he's saying is that when it says on, you know, the sixth day God made, he's going to challenge things like what it means to make. You see what I mean? So,
I think that hints at this idea that it's saying more than just what's made, but I would say it probably intent. I mean, we should take the historical. I mean, I disagree with all sorts of church history and doctrines and stuff, you know, on all sorts of things, but that's got to be taken into account, at least as being like supporting that God said, or people believed what God essentially intended, at least, you know, it's not one for one, but I mean, it should be weighty, I guess, that no one understood. I mean, to think that no one understood something for so long, maybe it doesn't matter, but what do you think?
John's actually not that far apart from, I think, a lot of young Earth creationists. Is just that he doesn't think that the Bible's teaching science. So, and if CJ wants to comment on this as well, like what he says is that, okay, so Genesis isn't trying to indicate how God made, but rather he uses the analogy of a house and a home. He says that God wasn't trying to indicate to the Israelites how to build a home or build the cosmos, right? but instead how to order a home, or a house, right? Not how to build a house, but how to build a home. So how to, make a place like home, because really he's saying that just like Exodus, just like Leviticus, just like all the rest, it's Genesis is talking about sacred space, making a space sacred for God to dwell in. And so whenever they rebel at Babel and things like that, then God is withdrawing his spirit from those people, because they're making the space to like proclaim their own names and things like that, So he's basically, he goes through all the text and he's like, look at this and look at the parallel between the temple inauguration in First Kings and in other places where basically they're trying to make sacred space. And so he just shows all the parallels that show. And then he goes at the end, he goes, hey, look, if young earth creationism is true, that's fine. That's fine with me. I don't have a problem with that. It's just that I don't think that Genesis, it's showing a functional view and not a creative type view, So, but yeah, there's plenty of room to disagree on all that. Yeah.
Well, I think I would kind of say a couple things on that. So I first note I would say is, and I've actually shared this with Sentinel Apologetics Rob Rowe before, because he's also presented me with the same point, which of course both of you guys are talking about John Walton's original idea, right? And my point, both to him and right now, would kind of be, I don't understand, I guess, why it would have to be one or the other. In fact, the pattern that I would find, the consistent pattern I would find in the book, not even just the book of Genesis, but in the Old Testament total, but also specifically in the book of Genesis, is that things which operate polemically do happen in history, even if they operate polemically. When it pertains to the Bible, right? And so as an example, I think a very obvious example if you're an Egyptologist, but maybe not so obvious of an example if you're just your regular run-of-the-mill Christian or Jew, right? Because nobody's necessarily going out and studying Egypt history just because, for the fun of it, although a couple of us are, I guess. But when you look at the plagues, right, of Moses, when he shows up during Exodus, right, and you look at the gods that are worshipped and how they're worshipped and the religious traditions and so on and so forth of the ancient Egyptian people, especially at that time, which would be roughly the 15th century BC if the Bible's taken at face value. This is a very clear and obvious polemic against these gods, right? Going after the frogs because the frogs are considered to be a god, going after the sun because the sun is considered to be a god, going after the Nile because the Nile is kind of given divine status, and the Pharaoh because the Pharaoh is given divine status, and so on and so forth, right? Even down to the firstborn, who, of course, if he's the firstborn of the royal wife, is the crown prince and set to be the morning and evening star according to their traditions and things of that nature, right? He's a very, very important figure. And yet, that has to be a historical event in order for the Israelite faith before us, and then the Christian faith that I think is the legitimate continuation of that after, right? Because it is on that event that God stakes his entire credibility to the Jews, right? Remember what you saw here. Remember what happened in the wilderness. Remember what I brought you through. Remember these miracles and how we went up against the Egyptians and how I actually showed you, and how I showed, you again and again and again. And I showed the Egyptians again and again and again. And I brought them to heel and I delivered you from their hands and so on and so forth. And it's repeated all throughout Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. And then again by Amos and Isaiah and Hosea and so on and so forth, right? And then Jesus himself is even a typology, or actually, excuse me, other way around. Moses is a typology and the whole Passover of Jesus himself, right? Where Jesus is now the Passover lamb sacrificed on the high Sabbath of Passover, which is commonly believed to be April 3rd of 33, but that's obviously up for plenty of dispute. Nonetheless, one of the high Sabbath that just so happened to also correspond to the day before a Sabbath, so a Friday. And he's now the Passover lamb, and when the blood is now put on your house, so to speak, right? The death angel passes over you and you are saved, right? And that's the very basis of the sacrifice, right? Is that event that took place in history. As is, like I said, the constant reiterations of the prophets and the law and all that, right? So my point there being that just because this is a polemic doesn't mean that it's not historical. In fact, the text demands that it is historical. And in fact, the polemic is made even stronger by the fact that it was historical, right? It's not just that God had a polemic against the Egyptian Pharaoh as God, but that polemic actually was true and bona fide and set up and founded within history, right? And I would say the same thing is probably true in this particular instance, if the temple dedication thing is true at all. And I say if because, to be honest with you, I think there are some assumptions when we start comparing the Bible to Mideastern texts that, if these assumptions are not made, actually do kind of I derail the narrative a little bit. Like, so for example, you brought up suzerainty treaties, right? And one of the ones that people point out often is, I think, Asher Hardin is how you say it. But nonetheless, this Hittite Neo-Hittite leader, who is from like the 700s BC. And if you look at Deuteronomy and compare it to this suzerainty treaty of Asher Hardin, or however you say his name, they do appear to be incredibly similar. Eerily similar even, right? To the point of where it does seem somewhat odd to say that these people who were so close to each other didn't have any influence one on the other, right? However, you have to make an assumption there that Ashur-Haddon's treaty actually came first in order to make the assumption that this is now a polemic or using that sort of a pattern, right? If indeed Deuteronomy is reflecting a tradition that goes all the way back to Moses, as it claims. And in fact, Deuteronomy is one of the ones that in particular would claim this, because Deuteronomy is written in the form of a recording of a very, 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 very long speech from Moses. Right. And Exodus and Deuteronomy, at least, are a little bit indisputable as far as their own claim to be Moses's work, or at least tradition going back to Moses. You could make some argument about Leviticus and Numbers, but I wouldn't personally, because I think the rest of Scripture is clear that all 5 of those books are Moses's in some way. And if that's the case, right, if Deuteronomy really does go all the way back to potentially even 1400, then if there's any relation at all, it's the suzerainty treaty of Ashur-Haddon that's actually getting influence from Deuteronomy, not the other way around, right? And that's assuming that there is any influence, because obviously a lot of times people do end up having incredibly similar stories, incredibly similar treaties, incredibly similar traditions, despite having no relation to each other at all. I think just an interesting technological example of that is how many different times the bow and arrow was invented, right? Every culture in the world seemingly has figured out the bow and arrow, at least almost every culture in the world. But obviously not every culture in the world is necessarily related to each other or getting that from each other or something along those lines, right? Like, you can't say the people who were using the bow and arrow in Mongolia were influenced by the Romans just because they both had it, and maybe the Romans came first, right? It wouldn't necessarily work. Now, and that's a little bit of a reductio ad absurdum, but the point I think still does kind of stand, right? And to sort of just wrap it all up, I guess, in a bow, I would just say that I see no reason to say this can't potentially be written as a polemic against some pagan gods and also reflect a level of reality, right? And I would also just sort of briefly note on that while I would agree Genesis isn't teaching science in the sense that it's not like a science textbook, right? It's meant to communicate God created the heavens and this is how he did it. It's not necessarily meant to communicate this is the water cycle and, the property of atoms and all that other kind of stuff. But I think that when it presents a truth that we would understand in a scientific manner, for example, that kinds produce their own kinds, just because the book itself isn't scientific doesn't mean that we wouldn't necessarily understand that as scientifically accurate, right? And so while I think it's true that the Genesis account isn't necessarily meant to be science, I think it's also true that it is presented as if historically accurate and therefore effectively becomes somewhat scientific.
I agree with you pretty much perfectly. I think Walton
I agree.
differently, doesn't he? Converse, like he wants to
Yeah,
say.
he agrees with that.
Doesn't he say though that if I recall that the Genesis account isn't like, he affirms that God created everything or whatever, but that the account of the days per se is just, it's ordering it rather than actually material.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. He agrees with all that. He would just hear everything you just said and be like, yeah, I agree with all that. He's just all he's gonna say is that, and I'll ask him on Friday just to clarify. But like, in the book, he basically says that, like, hey, listen, yes, I totally agree with you. It says plenty of times about Yahweh creating everything. God created everything. God is the one that created the stars and the skies and the cosmos and everything. It's just that Genesis wasn't intended to be read how we are reading it. We're reading it. It's a standard temple inauguration text in which he's using the cosmos analogy to relate to them how the temple, how to make a sacred space. And it's not to have a chaotic world. It's to have the ark in a certain spot, in a certain way, in a certain tent, with certain cherubim wings on top of it, with in a certain part of the temple, in a certain area, in a certain place that I'm going to give you, but we're going to have to go to, get you the land and all this stuff. So yeah, he would just agree with all the things you said. Just that he's just using the analogy of him making and ordering the cosmos as how they're going to have to make and order the temple that he will dwell in, the same as he's dwelling in the cosmos. He created everything, and then he sat back and started basically like operating, so like he got all of the equipment in order. He set up the right parameters, then he sits down behind the knobs or whatever, and that's what he's basically saying, is that it's projecting toward the future. Because Walton and some others, I don't know, I mean, I'm imagining he studied this more than I have, but they're going to say, look, we have a bunch of like maps of what they thought the cosmos were like, and they're not anything like what we think they're like. But that's fine, because God didn't intend to teach them science. Instead of telling them that he has the number of molecules in your DNA strand numbered, he told them, I have the number of hairs numbered on your head. That way, but we know those two are connected, right? So, but he didn't care to tell them about how to build a house or how he built the house, but instead how he built the home and how they will build a home that he will dwell in. And so that's why Exodus and all that's all about taking the ark, which God dwells in, to the Holy Land and setting it up in the temple, where they will finally have everything ordered and he will rest on his throne with the ark as his footstool and all that stuff, So anyway, but I think he would agree with pretty much everything you said. Besides that, like, yeah, maybe still young earth creationism is true. And of course, God created everything, like so. But anyway, I've still got a lot to learn about it, of course, and I'm not saying that I wholeheartedly accept all of it. I'm just, there's, it's making a lot of sense since I've been studying it, but there's still much more to go,
Yeah, well, and I absolutely feel that, because I'm in the same boat there for sure. The one thing I think that I would kind of point out, though, is just that I think that, and even, you even pointed out that you think that Walton might even potentially agree. And I think that's great. Don't get me wrong. However, I think that does kind of fundamentally kill his argument as an argument, at least. In other words, what he's saying could certainly be true. All his scholarship could certainly still be accurate. But when presented now as an argument for or against young or old Earth, I don't think it works because it can be granted on either model, right? Like I can grant that Genesis is presenting me a historical account of the cosmos being ordered and created, and also grant that God knew in his foresight that at the time this would be written down, namely by Moses, it would be culturally significant that it would be written down this way, or even perhaps that it would be presented that way because of the fact that God created it in such a manner, right? Either or could certainly work. But I guess the point just being that if something can be granted on either premise, right, then I don't think it really functions as an argument for or against either premise. And again, I would say, like, if we look at the rest of the Old Testament account, everything else that we see in the Old Testament account, even though it clearly gives, in some instances, polemic, and even though there's clearly parabolic understandings, meaning that there's stories here for us to glean the moral from, right? They still present as actual history, and even often demand themselves as actual history. For example, we already pointed out like the Exodus, right? But there's tons of other examples that you could go to, like Job, or like the conquest itself. Like a lot of King David and Solomon and their rules, or the different things that happen in Judges and all that, right? There's a lot of these stories that occur that we glean understanding from, in a more parabolic sense or in a metaphorical sense, even though the stories did occur in actuality. In fact, a perfect example of that is the Joshua typology to Jesus, right? Joshua's types to Jesus, in that not only do they share the same name, Yahashua and Yeshua, just being a diminutive form, but what we notice is that Moses, or the Old Testament, the law, is not capable of actually bringing you into the promised land, but only Yehovah saves, right? Or Yehovah Yesha, or Yahashua, right? Or Yeshua, right? And you continue to see the pattern here. I think it's a beautiful pattern personally. That's why I have to say it. But nonetheless, he's the one who brings not only the people into the promised land, but also destroys the wicked ones who are there, like the Canaanites and the Amorites and the Hittites and all those people, right? He's the one who ultimately defeats sin. And yet, despite that typology, we all would agree that Joshua absolutely presents itself as a narrative that occurred, right? And that two possibilities exist. Either the book of Joshua is wrong, or the conquest of Joshua existed, or occurred rather. But there's no like in between there as far as Joshua is concerned, because it's quite clear on the matter, right? And in the same way, I would say that we see this pattern consistently happening throughout the Old Testament. Why would we not assume that it starts with if it starts too? Because I don't even necessarily know that I agree that it is a temple dedication ceremony per se. I think it's an interesting theory. I have not heard it from Walton himself, and so I want to withhold ultimate judgment, because obviously he's going to be going in more in depth than people we just have discussions with. You know what I mean?
Sure. I agree.
But
we have to get that book. I want to read it too.
Yeah, absolutely. But I would just say, again, I don't think that when the pattern is consistently that the parable or whatever it happens to be happens in actuality, right? I don't understand why we would necessarily see it differently in the beginning. In fact, I would see that as the kickoff of the pattern. And
what is
by the way, when I say, just to be clear, I because I don't know if the phrase "I don't understand" is taken as aggressively. That's not how I mean it. Just to be clear on that, I didn't know. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, like in the case of the Suzerain Treaty, though, like even if it went all the way back, it still would have been used by the Egyptians, and like Abraham came out of the Mesopotamians, right? Like, so, I mean, I think that it's the same way that if I were to do something in the future and God were to reveal something to me, and I were to write it in kind of like my American language, right? Like to whom it may concern, blah 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 blah. I'm writing a letter, something that God's revealing to me or something, and then people found it, 2,000 years or 4,000 years later or whatever, and was like, well, look how he wrote it, to whom it may concern. So he's obviously taken from the Americans. But like I said before, it's just that I live amongst these people. So like an average contract is going to sound like that. If you look at Exodus chapter 20, the suzerain vassal treaties, that's how they start. They start by naming the suzerain and then giving a historical account about how they have interacted. And so if you look at the first, if you look at verse 2, it says, I am the Lord your God. So it indicates the suzerain. Then it says, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So then it gives the historical reference of the interaction, right? And that's called the prologue in the treaties. And then the names and titles, are I guess they're kind of important in the prologue, but and then it goes through the stipulations of the contracts, and it talks about it gives the first 10 commandments, and then it goes later on, of course, into the stipulations and like the blessings and curses. And
notice the commandment he gives his title and his dominion and his law.
What was that?
He said in the 10 commandments, it's the fourth commandment where he kind of does the same kind of thing. I'm Yahweh, and who brought, or what is it? It gives us his dominion of the, creating the earth and stuff. And then same kind of pattern, I guess I'm saying, in the fourth commandment.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So you're talking about the one where, remember the Sabbath day? Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah. The way it starts out, that commandment, it's similar thing you're talking about, I think.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. And also, if you look at like verse 4, where it says, you shall not make for yourself a graven image of any likeness of anything in heaven above, or anything that's in earth beneath. Wait, is that? No, I'm talking about, verse 3. You shall know no other gods before me. In a suzerain treaty, you would say like, hey, look, I'm going to protect you or whatever, but you cannot make any alliances outside of me or something like that, right? And all this isn't to say, all that is to say is just that they're doing what I would do if I came out of America and I were to write to whom it may concern. All I'm doing is using a structure that I know, because why would I use anything I don't know, right? I'm not just going to make up something new and just be like, all right, let's make up a contract. I'll just say I start here and you're going to rule me or whatever. You know what I mean? Like I understand. I mean, you guys, I'm sure agree, but just you use what's known to you, but at the same time, the polemics that are used in it, you shall have no other gods before me. You can't have a graven image. These types of things where the other nations had images, with my interview with the Egyptologist, that's what he was talking about. They would take their images. They would actually, the idols, they would actually put them to bed and feed them and all that stuff. And he's like, no, so this is like when the other people are reading this stuff, they're like, oh, okay, these people are trying to be like, our God doesn't need to be in an image or in an idol or whatever, and that type of thing. So I guess that's Walton's main point, but yeah, I mean, feel free to, if y'all want to say anything, and I'm good to get back to like the debate, because I just wanted to say something before I left about John Loftus's kind of performance, but yeah, I just I thought that would be interesting to bring up, talking about Rauser, and whether I can agree with you that he's not a fundamentalist, because I accept basically what you said, that like when it's claiming to be historical, I take it as historical, right? I'm not going to read a historical text like I brought you out of the land of Egypt or something like that, and then go, well, they weren't really in Egypt, right? It was just, I'm not going to do that. That doesn't make any sense.
Right, and I would even say, like, so for example, you brought up Dr. Falk, right? I have significant disagreements with Dr. Falk in that, not that we've ever discussed anything, but in that I take a 15th century view rather than a 13th century view on the Exodus. But also, I think David Roll's new chronology is rather convincing, right? So I'm like doubly opposed. At the same time, though, Dr. Falk does take the story literally, right? He does think Moses actually showed up, actually performed miracles, and then actually led the Exodus out. So,
he just doesn't think you can get the early date just because where the capital is. Well, because the capital was in Thebes, and so it was 300 miles away. And so in the text where it says Moses was traveling to where he went to see Pharaoh, and then he woke up the next day and went to see Pharaoh, he would have had to travel 300 miles on camel there and then 300 miles back. And he just it couldn't have taken place, or we would have to just reject all of the chronology of the other nations and all their all their agreements and stuff. We'd have to reject all of them. But the crazy thing is, for the late date, it actually they moved the capital to only 2 kilometers outside of Avaris, and so his point is just kind of like the late date just all adds up. And the only other good argument for the early date would be that 400 and whatever 30-year period,
480
or 480 year, yeah. But his argument is that just like in other passages where they use ideal numbers, they're using ideal numbers here because 480 is 1240 times. And then he quotes in his book I believe it's an Akkadian source around that time that says they rebuilt the temple 780 years later, but it couldn't have been 780 years later. But if you know that culture, they used a sexadecimal base 60 math, which is just, that would make that 780 years just, was it 1260 times or something like that?
720?
Yeah, so, and
Yeah,
I'm actually, I'm quite familiar with the arguments in that, and in fact, there's I wanted to get an interview with Dr. Falk just to have him present his opinions, not necessarily have me refute them, but just present them, just because I wanted to sort of give my audience a little bit of a insight on that, because I'm actually kind of frequently arguing for some of the early date things, and I think there is some things that are certainly, and I'm not saying necessarily purposefully, but they're certainly, I think, misrepresented by some late daters, if I may just be frank. It's just as an example, right? So the idealized number 1, right? 12 times 400 or 12 times 40 equals 480. And so therefore this may potentially be an idealized number that shows, or that is, trying to give this sort of perfect time in between when the Mosaic covenant was established and they set up the temple, right? But there are a couple internal problems with that, just with First Kings itself. The first and most important one being that this is actually not 480 years, it's 479 and some change. And if you were trying to do things for the sole purpose of perfecting it, then you would probably not make that kind of a pedantic mistake, right? You're actually in the 480th year, not necessarily 480 years later, right? But of course, it also is presented in a book, namely Kings, which is hyper historical, presenting chronology in a very straightforward and historical manner. The only book I think that you could argue is more historical in all of Scripture is probably Chronicles, and indeed Chronicles and Kings are kind of merisms of each other in a lot of ways. But nonetheless, to just sort of digress on that.
Well, he would say that the 40s aren't meant to be taken as literal 40s, right? That was his whole point about ideal numbers, is if you look at 40s, right? Look at 7s and look at 40s. He's saying that, well, it's not just him, right? This came way before him, but people have known about this for years, but just that, Moses, his life was in 3 40s. right? He lived 40 years and then this happened. He lived 40 years and then this happened. He lived 40 years and then this happened, right? You look at like it rained with the ark narrative, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. But then if you look later on, it kind of gives a different number for the amount of time that the waters rained on the earth. And then if you look at like the 40s used for like they were in the wilderness for 40 years, or the 40 days and 40 nights, Jesus being tempted for 40, Nineveh, their prophecy about 40s. You look at all of the 40s that are used, and if you go through all of them, you're going to find out that like these can't be numbers that are like literally 40 because of the other numbers given. And so that's kind of like the point about 40s and sometimes 7s as well, that they're used in like it's kind of like a way of rounding or something like that. So I guess
but to be honest, I think that kind of reveals a little bit of the issue in a couple ways. I mean, the first way just being that 40 is nowhere actually presented in this particular passage, right? It's 480, and you have to sort of extrapolate the 40 by virtue of saying, well, this is supposed to be 40 times 12 and all that, which again, I think doesn't work considering it's actually 479. But the other problem I think that's very important with this particular thing is assume that they are rounded numbers, right? People don't round up 150 years typically. They round up a couple decades at most in these instances, right? And I think the example that is often given, not only by Dr. Falk, but also by like Dr. Josh Bowen and others, not that those two are similar in what they're trying to present. One is a Christian, right, and an atheist, but that they both do take the position that if there was a historical exodus, it would happen in the Ramesside period. And you know, for the same reason, this idealized number thing, and they give the same example, which is that Temple of Ishtar and the 720 years in between its building and the rededication of it, right? The problem with that, though, is that if you actually look at the two kings in question, they do the ends of their reigns are separated by about 700 years. And so we don't know when exactly the Temple of Ishtar was actually built the first time. We do have a solid date as to when it was rededicated, but if not a literal 720 years, at worst, it's only a decade or two off, right? It's very, very close to the actual number, if not actually the actual number, because like I said, we don't actually have the date itself. But it's about 1900 BC that the first king in question, and both of their names are fleeting me at the moment, but I have done a video on this actually on early arguments for the early Exodus, and you know he ends at about 1900 BC, and if you go to the other king, the other one in question, he ends in about 1107 BC. I believe the temple rededication takes place in like 1125 BC, and in 1945 BC. This other king is supposed to still be reigning because he's said to have had an incredibly long reign. So it is entirely possible that it actually is a literal 720 years. But even if it's not a literal 720 years, it's not off by 180 years, like the Ramesside period would have to be when compared to 480, right? Because 480 versus 300, that's a huge difference. At worst, it's off by maybe 20 years. And I would argue it's more likely that it's not off than not, because it's actually entirely possible, and in fact likely, I think, that if these numbers do have extreme significance to a culture, that a culture would actually intentionally try to meet these deadlines. And I'll give a perfect example from the modern world, but it still pertains to Israel. Former President Donald Trump moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem on the 70-year anniversary, on the day 70-year anniversary, right, of the foundation of the state of Israel. But that wasn't on accident, right? It was because of the fact that 70 has such significance to them. And I think it's more likely that occurs than to say these people are just rounding up by potentially centuries. You know what I mean? And I think that also does end up ignoring quite a bit of other information too. Like, for example, if you go to the Book of Chronicles, it lists the generations of a certain figure. None of these names are names that I am retaining very well, so I apologize. But it's a temple
No problem.
musician in David's court, or actually, I think he's in Solomon's court, but nonetheless, and it counts from him all the way back to his descendants from the tribal times. In fact, even before that, to the patriarchal times. And if you count the generations between him and Moses's era, you'll get 18 or 19, depending on where you decide to stop, right? And if you do the math for a literal generation, right, because it's not actually giving you any numbers for the generations, it's just saying this person who begot this person and so on and so forth. So just give a 25-year general area. You end up right smack dab in the 14th century. You have the same thing with Jephthah when Jephthah says we've been in this land 300 years when he's speaking against the Ammonites, right? And you guys never came to take the land from us then. Why are you coming to take it from us now? Well, Jephthah is around 1100 BC. If you just take a conventional chronology, 300 years past there gets you to roughly 1400 BC. And that would be about the time on a late date that you'd expect Joshua to be showing up, right? And so, when we look at a lot of the, I would actually, to be honest with you, go as far as to say, even though I'm not questioning anybody's Christianity or anything like that. Don't get me wrong. I think these are absolutely tertiary issues, but I do think I would go as far as to say the text of Scripture actually demands a early date, because it seems to me like the only really solid argument, scripturally speaking, for the early date or the late date rather, is the mention of Ramses as the city, one of the cities that they built, right?
Well, also I think Moses visiting the Pharaoh.
Or is it Varus?
Well, Moses visiting the Pharaoh, I think, could be explained by, and that's a good question, actually, Jamie. It's going to be answered by what I'm about to say. Moses visiting the Pharaoh could be explained, I think, from a couple of different things. Number one, it could be, if we just have a conventional chronology, that the Pharaoh, for whatever reason, was in this particular area, maybe because there's some kind of a crisis going on. That certainly could be. And I don't think that's necessarily an unreasonable thing to assume, right? It could also be that this is just taking place over a very long period of time. And most people have assumed that the Exodus plague incidents probably took roughly a year. So I think that could be true as well. But I think the big thing I would argue is, honestly, I think this is a very solid argument for David Roll's new chronology, because Avaris, which is at the same place where Ramses would be, did happen to have a very large Semitic population, and also was the capital of Egypt, but long ago and far away on the Egyptian chronology. It's sometime around the 1600s BC. And David Roll's point has been that not only with the Israelites, but also with other cultures, if you adjust the Egyptian chronology, it does seem to coincide better with what other cultures have for their own established chronology. And he then suggests that perhaps we have the Egyptian chronology wrong. Yeah. I think this is a perfect example of that potentially being the case, in that, if Avaris is actually the capital during this time, which is the city that Ramses ended up rebuilding in the first place and calling P. Ramses, right? Then you have the self-same thing going on, right? Where he's right there in Goshen for Moses to speak to.
Well, here's a few things, right? So one thing would be that during the time, though, that you're suggesting, the capital would be in Thebes, 300 miles away, and so you might say that Pharaoh, maybe he was living on location somewhere else or something, but it's like it didn't seem that way from the text, right? By all his court, like the talk of his court and stuff like that. But I mean, perhaps, right? But he even argues, like in the book, that the earliest mention of the early date is 1906, and all the rabbis going back to antiquity all used the late date. And
I gotta just correct that, though, because that's very false. And I've heard Dr. Falk make that claim, And I have to assume, because I don't want to assume ill intent, I have to assume he's just uninformed, but that is incredibly untrue. In fact, the Cedar Olam from the 1st century puts it at the it obviously wouldn't be called the 15th century, but it would have the late date, right? In fact, the Cedar Olam is what they base the modern Jewish calendar off of. That's 1st, 2nd century. The Talmud has reference to a early date. James Ussher gives an early date. Jerome gives an early date. In fact, a lot of them put it in even as far back as what we might call the 15th century.
Because Usher's that's what he said is.
Apologies. Go ahead.
Yeah, because he said that Usher's chronology was kind of popularized inadvertently by the Schofield Reference Bible, and so he does mention that. But he does say that the let's see, what's the I forget the guy's name. It's the rabbi he mentioned, because you said the Talmud. He mentions a rabbi Hillel. He mentions him and says that he takes he took the late date as well. And I'm not sure the reference you gave to what was the first reference you gave?
Cedar Olam.
Yeah, the Cedar Olam. Yeah, you're saying that they took the early date in that?
Yeah, and in fact, the Cedar Olam is the basis for the modern Jewish calendar, which in turn is the basis for the both young Earth creationist and early date understanding of the scripture, because they both get their understanding from Masoretic readings, right? And the Cedar Olam is written all the way back in either the 1st or 2nd, potentially as late as the 3rd, but that's your terminus. What is it? Terminus ad maximum or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to try and sound more educated than I am, but your latest possible date, right?
Okay. Yes, I'm not sure about that one, so I'll look into the Seder Olam, but he does give some of the early rabbinic writings that give the late date. There were some other points that you made though. About the numbers. We see evidence in text in the scripture about and this is obviously we're just kind of talking here, so this isn't like a debate or anything, but
right.
You notice probably that the old ages that are given to people, like 600 years or so of people living, and then like Abraham's father, depending on how you calculate it, would be probably about 130 when he had his either Abraham or his brother. And when Abraham was 100, he laughed that he would have a child at 100 years old in his old age. And it's just like, if that's not even old, that's like, you're just starting, buddy, And so, and then also like Matthew and Luke, the difference between their genealogy is like, because Matthew wanted to use these 14s, like his purpose wasn't to try and indicate numbers, because he was a Hebrew and he's a Jew, and Luke is a Greek, and Luke was more concerned about getting like the accurate, like what is like the exact numbers, where Matthew was more like wanting to use these 14s, because 14s are they mean something to the Hebrews, right? They have a textual meaning rather than the exact numbers or whatever. And so, yeah, I would use examples like that on the number side, but then in the actual other part of the Exodus side is like the Amarna letters kind of gave us kind of a conflict between reading 1 Kings 6:1, the Israelite conquest of and Joshua 11:11 that says Joshua destroyed Hazor with fire. Joshua must have been at least 13 years old at the time he was sent as a spy into Canaan as a young man, right? And so in Numbers 13, and if Joshua lived to 110, it might be suggested from a literal reading of Judges 2:8 that when he died no later than 1349 BC. The problem is that this guy Abdi-Tershi or whatever, the king of Hazor, ruled well into the reign of Akhenaten, to 1351 to 1335. Thus, he was not only ruling still, but expanding his territory in 1349. And so the early date doesn't allow enough time for that ruler to have accomplished what he did during his reign. And also the biblical text identifies the king of Hazor as Jabin, not as Abi-Tershi. So that shows that Hazor had completed its territorial expansion by the time Joshua encountered it by Joshua 11:1 and 10. And so that's kind of like a point that he made in his book about the Amarna letters, giving us this like insight into the difference in time there. And like obviously that's just one of the arguments, but he also gave a really bad review of David Rohl. He seemed to think that he wasn't I guess
he doesn't have 3 PhDs.
What was that?
He doesn't have 3 PhDs, probably.
Well, no, it wasn't that. I mean, he just, I'm just
kidding. Falk's been really cool. He answers questions on his channel like really timely and thoughtfully.
Yeah, well, I do want to say though that I haven't actually watched much. I've only watched like one thing by Rohl, so I can't say anything about him negative because I don't know enough about his position, of course. But Falk didn't seem to take his position seriously.
I could just give a couple plugs for my own self just because I've done these recently, right? I did my own personal video on the internal evidence for an early Exodus. And again, I would say, honestly, I don't mean to be as blunt as this, but I kind of have to. I think the text does absolutely demand a early date. I think that you can get to historical arguments potentially, and I would even dispute those historical arguments, but the text itself, I think, is abundantly clear. And I actually present those reasons in an early Exodus episode that I did just a couple weeks ago, actually. But then also before that, I did do an interview with David Rohl where he presented a lot of the evidence for potentially revising the chronology. And, I would kind of point out with a couple. So like, for example, with the Abraham thing, right? First off, obviously 100 is still incredibly old. So it's almost it's an interesting objection to bring up at all, considering the fact that Abraham is 100 and is going to go live to be 185. Right. It's almost like you use, and I don't mean just you, but I just mean that this is an argument, right? Just to be clear. Right. So I don't want to be like confrontational or anything, but like people use this as sort of a point to suggest, Abraham having a level of disbelief at a person of this age ever conceiving, and therefore these people couldn't really be this age. And yet, we're thinking Abraham is 100 years old at this point and is said to live to be 185 even still, right? So it's almost like you only reduce the problem, right? You don't necessarily solve the problem. And we know that age has to be literal because Jacob is asked by the Pharaoh when he goes into Goshen, how old are you? And he says he's 130, but short and evil have been my years compared to that of my forefathers, right? In other words, literally saying like, yeah, I know I'm old and it's amazing that how old I am, but you should have seen my pops and my grandpops, you know what I'm saying? And all that.
Yeah.
And so when the question then, arises as to whether or not Abraham could have kids, I think honestly, the primary focus of the text is really put on Sarah. Abraham, I think, is more, referencing his age, not so much because of the fact that he's 100. After all, he just had a kid 13 years ago in Ishmael, right? But more in that he's been married to Sarah since his youth. Sarah, who is female, by the way, obviously, right? But what does that mean? It means she goes through menopause, meaning there's actually a point in time where her body will stop having the ability to produce children. One of the benefits of being male is, barring mechanical problems, there is theoretically no limit to your age, to the age at which you can produce, right? Not to get too crass, but basically there's certain ages to which you can no longer become aroused, right? And we'll not go any farther than there, but theoretically speaking, males can have children indefinitely, right? So long as everything mechanically were working. Females, that's obviously not true. They go through menopause, obviously sometimes even as early as 35, and potentially even as late as in the 50s and 60s. But the point being that there's a major difference there, and we can expect perhaps it was a little bit different for Sarah if she's living longer, but she's still going to at some point go through that menopause. And in fact, the Bible seems to indicate that she did. It said that it ceased to be with her after the manner of women. So I think the primary emphasis here, when Abraham is saying that he's 100 years old and shall he have a child, is not actually in, him being 100, but in the fact that Sarah is 90, has been shown to be barren for many years because they've been with each other since their youths, and has actually gone through the thing that Abraham and everybody else already knows at this point, even though they don't call it this, as menopause. And so I think that's kind of the explanation in, I want to say a nutshell, but it kind of wasn't a nutshell. I went on for a little bit, but nonetheless, the point just being that I think that sort of explains why it is that Abraham could have this sort of a reaction and still all these ages could be literally true. I'd also like to point out the ages start to progressively drop as soon as the flood occurs. You go from 969 Methuselah to 950 in the case of Noah. And then it's in the 600s, I believe, for Shem, and progressively so on and so forth until by the time you get to Abraham, it's in the 180s, which is still very old. We don't have anybody today living 180, but it's no 900 or 700 or 600 or 500 or anything along those lines, right?
Have you seen?
So I think that partially could explain a lot of this too, as to why older generations are having children even older than Abraham and Sarah might be expected to. You know what I mean?
Did you know you could plot the ages, and it's a biological decay curve, the rate of age drop?
I have heard that before, but I don't necessarily have the ability to recall the information. You know what I mean? I haven't gotten too deep to it.
Dr. Sanford, John Sanford, is the one who presented it that I saw. He's pretty credible.
Yeah. So there'll be a there's also a parallel between the ages and the ages and the people in Genesis and the Sumerian Kings list. And I don't really have time to get into that right now because it's after midnight here, and I got to work tomorrow. So, but I would just say that yeah, I mean, I think that there's a way around the text or whatever, saying that Abraham was really just more worried that, or he was really more confused that Sarah would have a child at that age. I guess you could say that, for example, but I still don't know if that would get you out of it or not, right? Because it's gonna depend on how your whole thing about the decline curve or whatever. It's going to depend on how that plays out. Because if you can show through some type of modern math how it fits your view or something like that, but then you can show the Sumerian Kings list or something that's from their cultural time frame, and then it's do you pick the modern math or the modern theory over the cultural context? And so that'll be an interesting one to have a discussion on or something. With the biblical, you think that Exodus, the early date, is demanded by the text, and I don't think so, because like I said, the whole thing with Moses going to visit the Pharaoh so often, I just don't think that it could have occurred at that point, because he just couldn't have traveled that far. But the late date puts everything in order. Not only the king at Hazor, not only did they move the capital to Avaris, but just all the different details that that kind of map out. Because keep in mind, inspired philosophy, the whole thing that got David Falk kind of going on a bunch of shows, is the whole thing with inspiring philosophy trying to argue for the early date, and that entire documentary he made. And while listening to it, it did sound pretty good. But after, more research and like looking into some of the things, it didn't have really any substance to any of the arguments, because it just didn't line up with what we know about history and what we know about the text. Like one argument about the lambs that were found in the burial pits or whatever, but like the text says that they were eaten, right? So he would have had to have they had to assembled the bones back in the shape of a skeleton and bury them back the way they would have died naturally, right? But the text specifically says to eat the lamb, so and burn up anything that's left over. Don't leave it till morning or whatever. So, things like that. And I think he put about as much effort into trying to get the early date to fit as possible, and I still don't think it worked. And I guess, I don't know, I think there's just going to be some hurdles to overcome, because it just seems to me that the only thing you have to do with the biblical text is to do what Matthew and people all throughout the Bible do, is use these idyllic numbers. And so, and the fact that the 40s are used so often, that this is a multiple of 40 being used. I just think that, I don't know. I think that's the only thing you really have to do, is concede that one point that, okay, maybe this is just an idyllic number and it's using multiples of 40s, just like Abraham's life, just like the time in the wilderness, just like Jesus's, 40 days, and, the ark narrative about the flood, and, all the other ones, that the Nineveh, Jonah at Nineveh, and all the other ones. And I just don't know if you can read every date throughout, or every number given throughout, and seriously make all of them fit the exact time periods, especially with what we know about their time periods, anyway. But that's what I'll so let's just say that. But I'm sure there's a rejoinder to that. But
yeah, well, and I would just kind of say, I guess, just one brief thing, but I think it's an important thing. And I think it kind of hammers down on why I think this could be potentially, not like I said, I'm not here to throw stones at anybody, but why I think it could potentially be a bigger deal than people might make it out to be sometimes. There is sort of inherent in what you're saying, and I want to tread lightly, because I'm not accusing you of anything, right? So please hear me out. But it kind of inherent in what you're saying is a very effectively elitist mentality on the Bible. And let me explain what I mean by that, so it doesn't just come off as as an insulting thing, but as actually an adjective. What effectively happens is, now we can't understand this text, which is supposed to be God's inspired word for all peoples at all times, right? Unless we're hyper educated, know the cultural context, know the suzerainty treaties, know all this other kind of stuff, right? And I think that is, that can get you into dangerous territory which I don't believe anybody who uses this argumentation wants to get into. So I'm not trying to accuse anybody of anything, but territory which I think you do end up getting into nonetheless. And as an example, when you have Irenaeus from the 180s AD, when he wrote Adversus Heresies, which I actually own, it's a fantastic work if anybody wants to read it. I think it's absolutely important to read this thing, right?
Sure.
He's presenting one of the most important polemics against Gnosticism and Judaizing and all that other stuff in the history of the church. But he makes one really fatal flaw in that he says, he starts to make arguments that you need to understand the Bible through apostolic tradition, which he only had partially right, by the way, but just the point being apostolic tradition, right? And he's obviously a perfect, he's still a perfectly legitimate person. His work was still fantastic, all that kind of stuff. But that one mistake effectively created what would eventually turn into the massive beasts of like Orthodox and Catholicism that Martin Luther had to break from, because you couldn't say anything outside of quote unquote apostolic tradition. You know what I mean? Which was not Irenaeus's intent by any stretch of the imagination. And that's why I use him as an example, is to sort of like, say that I don't think that people are intending to go down this route, but like what you effectively do when you start to say, we need to understand the cultural context, and we need to understand the original language, and we need to understand this, that, and the other thing, like you would any other text in the Numa Elish, an Epic of Gilgamesh, and Iliad, something like that. Is not only do you turn the Bible into any other text, but you also withhold its knowledge and its contents from the vast majority of believers. Because the vast majority of believers don't live in the United States, even today, with access to computers and 6 different languages at their fingertips, and being able to go back in history and look at 1900 different theories on one particular event. And I'm only slightly exaggerating when I say that, right? The vast majority of believers, even today, are poor, are oppressed, are undereducated, are going to unfortunately live very rough, very impoverished, potentially short lives, right? And as a result, this text, if it's truly God's inspired word for them, just as much as it is for us, and just as much as it is for Dr. David Falk, even, who's even above our level, right? It has to be able to be understood by all of those people. And of course, there's certain things where things are going to be necessary. I don't expect, for example, the completely uneducated person on Sentinel Island, the first time he reads the Bible and passes the information on to his kids, to have a complete, solid understanding of the chronology of the kings, for example, right? But I do think if he decided to just look at it and take it at face value and say, okay, this king ruled this long and this king ruled this long and this kind of stuff, right, he'd get at least within the ballpark, right? Because I think that's the way the Bible is meant to be understood. And Jesus even says as much, right? He says, I thank thee, Lord, that you revealed yourself unto babes who would learn, and not unto the wise and prudent. Not to say that the wise and prudent can't learn. Obviously, Luke was saved, Stephen was saved, Paul was saved, right? Obviously, Moses is a very educated person, so on and so forth. But just to say that, like, the Bible is meant for the simpleton, right? Because the simpleton is the majority of people. Even the hyper-intelligent person, very often still, because of circumstance, is forced to be the simpleton. I just think we can get into very dangerous territory, I think, when we force the Bible to be understood by virtue of our own kind of secret and withheld knowledge.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I would just say that we have a westernized view of the text. I mean, that's the whole point, right? Like, we could both argue the exact same thing against each other's view, right? I can just say that, well, it's just kind of like a more modern view, and that every culture that they were surrounded with used 40s as an indeterminate time period. We have in all kind of texts from all the cultures they surrounded with, including in the Bible. Like, there are passages like in First Kings where it says that, David reigned for 40 years, but then it says his son Absalom, who returned at the end of his 40 years, approached David as king in 2 Samuel 15:7. So it's like, well, hang on, how could that have occurred? The two can't mix. They can't go together. So you have to make an explanation that tries to, marry the two. And you got to understand, of course, that that's also an argument that you hear about anything that's not a traditional view, is that, well, you got to be honest, this could be, like, is the average person supposed to read this like that? Like you get this from everybody. Whenever there's debate about, the like Ken Ham or Kent Hovind, right? They're one of their main arguments when they are faced with an old Earth creationist is going to be well, look, if a child was reading this, what would they say about it, right? But it's like, well, wait a second. When it says the sun was made on the fourth day, what do you think? And then they're like, oh, well, there was this thing about the canopy and, and they explain all this stuff. And it's like, well, if a child read it, what would they say? And it's like, we all have to look at the text and do, like we all have to interpret and figure out what we're going to do with certain passages. Yeah. So, I mean, I agree with you, of course, but that's the kind of the whole argument is whether we're taking it how it's supposed to be read or not, So, I mean, I think we can both agree on that if we're wrong, we both want to be corrected, or we both want to be, not teach something that's incorrect or whatever.
Right, I absolutely agree with that. And that is, of course, the reason why we have these discussions, right, is because we want to make sure that our iron is sharpening iron and everybody is
100%.
becoming more in line with the truth. I want to briefly acknowledge Brother Nicholas because he just showed up here. Thank you for joining us today. Did you catch the debate by chance?
Nope.
I'm getting a weird echo.
From me?
I
I
suspect
think
so,
so.
but I really appreciate the way you guys handled yourselves, by the way. I think that was really good discussion, the way you dealt with disagreement.
Yeah, sure. Well, me and CJ are working on stuff behind the scenes. Like we're talking about setting up a debate like through email today. So we're, we know we disagree on stuff. We're not, just like I disagree with a lot of people on different things, We're still brothers.
And generally, I'm not speaking of you specifically, Converse, because I didn't know if you were talking about anything specific when you were speaking. But I do concern that a lot of times people who hold the secular views over the biblical views, and I know there's an argument about that, and it's loaded when I say that, but I'm just being honest here. Those who hold the secular views over the biblical views, I concern that usually that's a matter of where they've actually placed their trust.
Yeah,
They
I
have
would agree with
trust
that.
in cultural conformity and in philosophy, and specifically inspiring philosophy. I've seen his testimony, and it's literally about how he learned creation arguments from Kent Hovind. He got embarrassed. So then secular academia set him straight about the Bible, thus saving IP from embarrassment. And to me, I remember being saved. The whole thing was like, it was all about being truthful, and God broke through my dishonesty and my sinful self and made me a new creation based on the recognition of truth. I mean, the idea of following after my own pride and motive and being afraid of being embarrassed, it's extremely hard for me to see how that sort of motivation counts as a Christian testimony in any shape, way, or form.
Mm-hmm.
And so just from the spiritual root, I see that IAP is just... and spirit, I think, is not emphasized often enough. Our motivation, our spirit in this, because I think Scripture's pretty clear that a Christian is someone who trusts Messiah, and that goes right along with worshiping God in spirit and in truth.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much all of that. But keep in mind, inspiring philosophy agrees with y'all on the date that we were just arguing about. The guy that I brought up was the guy that kind of debunked his view. And so he agrees with your view on this, or at least CJ. And so that wouldn't be... And then I agree with you that if you take secular views over biblical views, I agree with you that your allegiance isn't in the right place. That's why Falk and others, they argue from the text that they just don't think that it can work the other way. And then also, I'm having Kurt McGregor on this month, and he's a Molinist, and I'm reading his book about Molina, and these are all the same things that happened to Molina. The Reformation rejected him, and at least the leaders, and then the Catholic Church, of which he was a member, rejected his views and were like, no, because this is going to challenge some of Aquinas's view, and they're like, you're doing something dangerous here by trying to challenge Aquinas, like his view on this, right? Because Aquinas is like our hero or whatever. And so I think that tradition is really what would be challenged, not the like actual text, because Molina's whole point about his book was that he started with text and he was like, oh, wait, there's all these texts that you can't make sense of on Aquinas's view and on Calvin's view and so forth, on
Well,
Calvinism.
I'm confused from the get-go as to what it is that you're saying IP and CJ agree on.
Oh, we just had this big long conversation about Exodus.
Yeah, so I got IP takes the early date of Exodus, so 15th century, which would
Oh,
be
okay.
the
When I
definitive.
heard mention of IP and early date, I was thinking of Old Earth.
Oh no, I don't.
Yeah,
I don't.
no. Me and IP are very much opposed on that.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
go ahead.
Well, no, I'm about to take off, but I was just going to say I didn't take either view on the Earth. I took John Walton's view, which is that he thinks that Genesis 1 isn't teaching science. It's anyway. He goes into like a long. He has like 5 volumes of books on this, but
Yeah, and
but
I'm
basically
familiar.
he says either one can be true, but Genesis isn't trying to tell us which one's true.
Well, I mean, I agree with Walton's references to the symbolisms in Genesis and all of that. It's pretty clear that God speaks through reality. So the fact that the reality of the event of creation also has symbolism in it is not at all any kind of indication that that it's only symbolism. There's zero reason to jump to that conclusion. But I think, if I may ask you, Converse Contender, just run one little point by you real quick. How does Genesis chapter 1, what information does it give us about the length of a day?
Well, so this is where Walton agrees with the young Earth creationist that the day there, Yom, is indicating a 24-hour period. And he was a young Earth creationist for over 20 years. So he didn't have any type of reason to reject that. But he was, when he began to look at what's called a temple inauguration dedication text, he started to look at all the similarities between the words in Genesis and the words in Exodus and in First Kings and some of these later. And so he took like the term made, bara or whatever, and he would look at those and all the usages they have. And then he would say, can this make sense as being created from nothing or whatever, blah blah blah. And anyway, so he just takes all of the words that are used, finds all their meanings, because he's just a text analyst. So he just takes the text, he analyzes it, he finds out how the words used, and then he applies it. A lot of the terms we have in our Bible, like in the beginning, and like words that are filler words that aren't there in the Hebrew, it doesn't read the same way. Of course, it's going to read like beginning, God created, that kind of thing. And so he's looking at that, and he's just going to say that from the patterns, it's almost an exact pattern from the temple inauguration to the cosmos inauguration, and that it's
Well,
about
that's backwards, right? Like you've taken the chronology backwards in the probably the order in which the text was written. I mean, it's that the creation week is then the template for the temple inauguration.
Yeah, he agrees with that.
It's not the other way around.
He agrees with that. I wasn't saying that it was the other way around.
Oh yeah,
I
I don't mean to be too picky on words,
fine.
but it is relevant which one
that's
is
true.
the template for the other in this particular, on this exact topic. Which order is relevant? That's all.
No, I agree with that. Yeah, and so that's what he says. Is just that the Genesis account God's showing how he's just basically saying that he organized the universe, but he's using his creation as like an analogy to how they're going to create the temple and organize it in a way where he can dwell. So the creation days are this cosmic ordering where God is showing how he's ordering things so that he can dwell with man. And the same thing with the temple inauguration is how they should order the ark and the temple and the rooms and all that stuff so that he can dwell with man. And so it's all about God dwelling with man through, all of these things.
What is Walt about in the text where it says Moses builds the stuff after the pattern?
That was so muffled. I don't know what you said.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, better. Yeah.
Okay, so what does Walt have to say about the part in where Moses is on Sinai or whatever, or maybe it's not even that part, but where he says to make it after the pattern in heaven? Can you say that?
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the things that he uses from the text to say that, like, this is just showing that they're how they view the days of creation or whatever.
Well, I think we've gotten way off track there because in the New Testament, Paul is very explicit about what it means that the earthly is after the pattern of the heavenly. And it doesn't have anything to do with creation. It has to do with the eternal heavenly, not with the creation of the earth. And that is another thing I'd like to note is I think, I don't have any problem with Walton making any of those associations. I just don't see how any of that is an argument against what the text says. And I'm aware that
I don't know if you were here, brother, but that's actually exactly what I had said earlier.
Yeah, it's not an argument against the text.
Well,
everything the text says.
No, I disagree because the text is saying how the Creator God created, and that's the opening, and it's a big deal in our religion that the only Creator God is our God, but other religions claim they have the Creator God. And I think if we're to take what the text says, the text tells us that evening and morning is a day, and then the text also tells us that the stars and the sun and moon are what sets times and seasons. So it seems to me that in Genesis chapter 1, we have it specified that the sun is specifying a day, and then if God tells us that the others were days before that, I think if we stay just in the text is extremely one-sided here.
Wait a second, but you said the sun tells us what's one day, but then there were days before the sun.
Yeah, but the thing is that, you could spend, if you could travel to Mars, you could spend 24 Earth hours on Mars. It won't be one Mars day. But what I'm saying is that if we look in Genesis, God tells us the length of a day is set by the sun, moon, and stars, right? The lengths of times are set by those. So if the length of a day in Genesis chapter 1 is set by the sun, then it's kind of crazy to start saying that in the very same chapter, the length of days is not based on the sun.
He doesn't argue that. He says that it's 24-hour period. That's what I said earlier.
He doesn't. He says that there's a myth of 24-hour periods that symbolizes something else, that symbolizes our 24-hour periods. That is not the same as actually saying it is a 24-hour period. That's the difference between false gods and our gods. They are myths and our God is reality.
Yeah, I think you might have just misunderstood his position.
No, I don't misunderstand. I disagree.
Okay, it sounded like not what he said.
No, I'm well aware of what he says. It's just once you say that it's only symbolic, you're saying it's not true. That's just a fact.
Yeah, that's not what he says.
No, that is what he says. He says that it's 7 days in the text, but in physical reality, it's not 7 days.
No, that's not what he says.
I've listened to him lecture on it, Converse. I'm not going to argue with you. I'm just going to let the audience know that is what he says.
I'm having him on my show Friday, and I've been reading his book all week. But yeah, He just
Okay, well,
doesn't
maybe he's
argue
not
that-
consistent with himself or something. A lot of times when you don't have the truth,
or
you have
might
to contradict
misunderstand. I don't
yourself.
know. You might misunderstood what he said or tried.
Well, he
Sometimes
might
when you
have
disagree with somebody,
completely said something different than he meant. I mean, I
sometimes
didn't
when you disagree
misunderstand
with
his lecture.
somebody, you don't understand exactly what they're trying
I
to
mean,
get at.
he's a public person who puts his views out in the public, and it's kind of messed up that I can quote his explicit views that he expressed explicitly, and now you're trying to say he never said it.
You're
That
saying that
frustrates me
he's saying that
because
Genesis is just a bunch of symbols? That's what
no,
he
he
said?
said that the days in the text they're 24-hour days, but in actual creation, we're not actually hearing about the actual moments of creation that were actual 24 hours. That the 24 hours in the text is symbolic of periods of time which were not actually 24 hours.
No.
I don't think he thinks they're actually 24 hours, but I have heard him say, it kind of seems like he says both. It kind of seems like he says that the text intends for it to mean a regular day, but then it seems like he clearly personally believes that, he accepts evolution and all that, I think. So,
I don't think he said any of that about evolution.
well, I've just heard him talk about some of that before, like about his son and some things that I forget exactly. I should just not say.
I know his son's a graphic designer and he makes pictures for him and stuff, but yeah, his whole point is just that when Western people read Genesis, they read it with Western eyes, trying to science up the text, basically. And he says that when you read it in the original, it's not trying to indicate what the exact process was God was using to create. Yes, it's indicating that God's creating the universe and everything in it, but he's saying that to the Hebrews, their understanding of science was so far down, or not even the Hebrews, the people that were like Adam is mentioned in the text, right? And so the even all these people, right, that are mentioned in the text, he's saying that if you looked at their descriptions of the cosmos and stuff, right, they're gonna see the firmament above the heaven, and then the pillars under the earth, and Sheol under, the ground, and all that type of stuff. And so he's saying that if they were trying to give some type of scientific breakdown, they would be well, first he put Sheol down, and then he laid the foundations of with the pillars, and then he put the dome over and all this stuff. That's not what they were trying to indicate. Is that this is the way that he puts it as a house and a home, right? God's not trying to teach these primitive people how he built the house out of nails and brackets and stuff. Rather, he's trying to teach them how he made a home by organizing all of these things about the cosmos.
And can I use that analogy to clarify what I'm thinking here?
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't see, obviously Genesis is not a science text, it's a history text, and dating of events is a standard part of history. And in the history, it kind of just says, I built a house as part of describing how he made a home. So it's not that I don't entirely disagree that perspective offers insight. It's just it's not a scientific text, it's just a historical text that tells us vaguely about God doing creation, but it is a historical text, and it does have dating in it with the family trees, genealogies, and all that. So it's kind of annoying if people just jump to well, it's not a science text. That's a complete, I guess, red herring might be the right word for that. Because it's a historical text, and we're arguing about history. No one's arguing that it's a science text. I don't think anyone has ever argued that there's testing and observations described in the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 1, that there's testing via the scientific process described there. That's a complete red herring. We're talking about history.
I think your description of what I meant by science is a red herring or an equivocation.
Well, no, the argument uses the word science to avoid the fact that we're talking about history, including timing. Yeah. It's just that it's a red herring because the argument's weak. That's why people jump
Yeah.
to that science thing. It's just
We're using
irrelevant.
science
It's irrelevant
to
to mention the whole science thing because we're
Mm.
talking about whether or not it's history.
No, we're using science in two different ways here. I said that he's saying that this isn't trying to teach us any science, and by that I don't mean having a beaker in my
Of course,
hand
it's not
pouring
trying to teach us
chemistry.
science. I'm just wondering what
Well-
the point is. It's a history text.
Well, the point is that everybody in modern day, they're not going to Genesis and being like, "Oh, well, this is just."
Well, they
some
are,
text."
though. We've inherited this
Well,
tradition from 2,000 years
no.
of Christianity is where we have the idea of creation from. No one thought they scientifically observed it and then based how they read Genesis on that. We inherited
You're
it straight from
misunderstanding.
the text, and then we still trust the text to this day.
And this is you're getting a little bit emotional about the argument, and I'm trying to just keep it to the arguments. And so the point is that there are tons of people today on both sides, young and older.
I can be
that
emotional.
teach.
That is fine if I'm a bit emotional,
Yeah.
Converse.
It is fine, but it just distracts from the actual arguments and the points. That's all I'm concerned with is what's right. I'm not concerned with whether you believe.
Well,
in
that's okay. Your
sin or not.
arguments are distracting from the kingdom of God, but I'm not trying to shut you down from talking.
Why would you like? That's
So,
just.
I
an
mean,
assumption.
people can hear I'm emotional, but I don't know. It seemed like you intended to suggest that I should maybe be less emotional about an important topic. And I'm
Yeah, I
just
mean,
like,
because if we're talking about an intellectual topic like what's correct reading here or there, then one person gets to the point where they're like interrupting everything you say, then it's like, well, how is that? We're no longer talking intellectually. I'm just talking about your feeling on what you believe or something. It's just more about your belief than it is about what the text is actually trying to indicate. And so that's how
well,
it gets
no,
boring.
I mean, I was focused on you kept trying to characterize it as people are trying to say it's a science text, and that's just way off base. It's completely irrelevant.
Yeah, and I just think you're using science in a different way than me because everybody who comes to the text are either saying that Genesis is showing young Earth creationism or it's showing old Earth creationism. And his view is that it's not showing either. That young Earth creationism may be right, but
Yeah.
it's not because the text is proving it or something. It's because it's actually what the evidence is for the world or whatever. Like when you look at science, that's what it indicates is that so you can. I even watched the thing with him earlier today where he said, "Hey, you can convince me that it's either way, that it's young or old. I'm not going to take a view here. I'm just going to say that this isn't what they're trying to indicate. The authors of the text did not care one bit about telling you how God made the universe, nor is God telling these people exactly how He made the universe. And even if He wanted to, they wouldn't have even understood it. Like He's just indicating how He organized space and then rested on the seventh day, and started operating basically and dwelling among people."
See, and I guess
Well, if I may
And
just
look-
make one response real quick, CJ, and I'll leave it, because
Yeah, sure.
my God is the God of creation, not the God of
Mine too.
sorting out what was already there.
I
And
didn't say
the
anything about that. That's a
the
straw
creation
man.
account is it's a historical account of creation.
Yeah, that's a straw man. I agree, and so does John Walton, that God created everything,
No,
and he's just saying that the text is not telling how God created everything and in what time period.
well, you said John Walton agrees that the text is telling us it's in 6 days. Now you're saying he doesn't agree with that.
What?
Earlier when I said that he said the text shows 24-hour days, but he claims the days were not actually 24 hours. You
No, that's
argued
not
with
what I
me
said.
about that, and now you're agreeing with that. I mean, this is.
No, I didn't.
I'll
You're
just
just making
step
up
out
stuff.
of discussing with you, Converse, because reason has
That's
been
fine.
lost.
Oh yeah, I mean I agree with that. That's if you can take from what I said and make it into what you just said, then you missed the whole conversation basically.
Well, I think if I may, the point kind of being communicated here because there is a certain level of truth to it, right? Is that so? John Walton admits that the text is certainly indicating a 24-hour day, right? But then he'll say that the text is not meant to literally indicate a 24-hour day, meaning that God is not communicating that he literally created in a 24-hour day. In other words, the text is using a literal 24-hour day as a literary device. You know what I mean? And therefore making it no longer a literal 24-hour day in any historical sense. And I think that's kind of the important thing in distinguishing Genesis as a history book rather than a science book. The science behind, like, for example, the hydroplate theory, might be something that you have to figure out on your own time, and whether or not that's true or not isn't really the point, I guess. But just, you know, that you'd have to figure it out. But the history of how, when, and, you know, how long ago the Earth was created and humans were created, I think it isn't necessarily the same question, and I think is clearly communicated in Genesis. And correct me if I'm wrong, Nicholas, but I think that's the primary point: is the literal day is used literarily, and therefore ceases to be a literal day because there's no literal day being communicated. You know what I mean?
Or it's being communicated, but to say something else. But
Both and.
yeah, that's a. I mean, I agree with what you're saying, CJ. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, with me, the point is always ultimately going to dig all the way to the spiritual, right? So to just say that that's my only point, I think, you know, it's all more holistic and deep than that as far as what my points are. So that's the only caveat I'd put on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do notice now, just we are hitting about 2.5 hours. Just about. We're up to it in 21 minutes, actually. I don't want to completely wind down, but I do want to start the organic process of winding down. But nonetheless, if anybody has anything else they want to say and or discuss before that happens, by all means.
Yeah, so I mean, I just, I don't know, I would just say that I don't think this is actually that controversial. And I think that as John Walton was a young Earth creationist for over 20 years, and then he began to look at the text and seeing how the text was related to other texts. And he said that he was quite unenthused with coming out of looking at Genesis as if it's teaching young Earth creationism. He was not happy about it, but he said that if he was honest with himself, he had to say that, like, what the authors were trying to intend wasn't what he was putting on the text through his modern lenses. So he says that people can't approach the text as modern people with a scientific notion, when the people back then, they didn't even have a distinction between natural and supernatural. They thought that everything that ever happened was God doing it, so that they wouldn't have looked at, like, you know, some of these things that we imply on the text, like where he's, you know, doing something supernatural. They wouldn't have looked at it like that. They would just be like, he's doing another thing. And like he argues about the word make or create being used in like 50 different places. And it's usually just, it means when you do it or something like that. So that it's, you can translate it as make or create, but it's like in the other places, it makes so much more sense to, it's like when you do it. So it's like when God did the heavens and the earth or whatever, you know, that kind of thing, where he's like, it doesn't really sound good in English. But scholars have always known this. Like, and if you'd be like, one of the points he made was like, a lot of people like to tell me, like, hey, it sounds like you're just trying to rely on the ancient Near East, you know, literatures and stuff to tell you about the text and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, you are literally relying on an English translator for your text. Like you're relying on the translation that they gave you when they didn't have nearly as much information as we do today, neither manuscripts nor context in the Middle Ages or whenever your Bible is translated. And so we all rely on the information we have to get to us what the text is actually saying. And, but I think he would agree that, or I know he would agree that God created everything, and that, everything pretty much that you're gonna believe, he's gonna believe it, except for that Genesis lets us know how old the earth is or something like that. So, but I'll give him some of your concerns on Friday when I talk to him and see how he responds to them.
Well, and I'd also even like to, I'll probably at some point try and find a way to talk to him myself, because there's
Sure.
I've been wanting to speak with a lot of these. I tried to reach out to, like I said, Dr. Falk, but Dr. Falk was seemingly not wanting to, come on, at least not for an interview. I don't know if he'd be more interested in a debate than an interview. But
well, he told me he doesn't debate, so it's gonna probably be an interview. But like, you should, what you should do is just tell him, you should wait like maybe 3 weeks or something, and then email him back, because he did mention that on a show he was on the other day, that he's just bombarded right now with emails and stuff.
Well, yeah, and I'm not, obviously I'm not, saying anything about it. If it happens in the future, it does. That'll be,
Sure.
Interesting. But I do think it'd be something that'd be interesting to talk about.
Definitely.
And I want to talk to Dr. Kenny Rhodes about some similar stuff too, because Dr. Kenny Rhodes would be Old Earth, as well as one who doesn't necessarily believe in a global flood. And I've wanted to talk to him about that stuff too. And potentially even with, I'd actually really like to debate Dr. Kenny Rhodes. That would be really cool. But I'm sure he has an honorarium of some kind that would have to be paid if that would happen.
Well, yeah, he's going to debate Matt Dillahunty on Modern Day Debate, right?
Yeah, I heard that actually tonight for the first time.
Yeah. So, but
Does he want to debate him on?
I would want to debate him on whether or not the Bible teaches a young Earth, or whether or not the Bible teaches a global flood. Either one of those topics, I think, would be perfect.
Yeah, and
you should.
the only thing is that I've heard him say he pretty much defers to his scientific colleagues to some extent. So I don't know if he would really present a full debate of what you're looking for, or if he'd only have like the one half of it,
Yeah, and well, I'm not a scientist, so my focus is always going to be primarily the text. So whether it's Rhodes or Walton, or I'll be debating Rob Rowe on July 1st, right? I always come at it from what does on the whether or not the flood was global or not.
Okay. You know what I would like to see you do is read Walton's books and do a review of them, because that would be really interesting to me, how you would translate the Hebrew where he would disagree and stuff like that, so I can see like what your argument is in the Hebrew or in the text. That's what I'd like to see, if you ever get a chance to get around and like do like a review or something of his books, because that would actually help more than just like
That would be good.
yeah, I'd love to hear something like that.
When are you interviewing him?
Friday.
Friday? At what time?
Oh, what time was it? I don't know, like 2:00 maybe.
I think I subscribed to your channel, but I haven't seen any notifications. When did you last post?
I think I had Dr. Sygard on or something like that.
Okay, then maybe I didn't miss any then. So that's probably just you haven't put anything up yet. Are you going to put a thumbnail up to kind of advertise it?
Yeah, maybe. I'm honestly, I'm not good with YouTube. I just kind of get on there whenever, and then
because it sends to your it sends a notification when you do that. It seems to me, at least, I'm still learning too. But like a CJ's thing and a lot of people's things will come up.
Okay. Yeah, I know. But I don't. I'm gonna have to. I mean, really, what I mean by that is I'm just lazy on YouTube. So, yeah. So, I also build furniture and do different things. So I'm like always really busy, and so I'm really lazy when it comes to YouTube.
You do woodworking?
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
So, yeah, so I was watching a thing the other night. Somebody sent me a clip from one of my old videos, and it had somebody in the comments going, "There's literally nothing in the description." And I was thinking, yeah, I was like, that sounds like me posting a video or something. But anyway, yeah, I'd like to see that if you ever, want to do that, CJ. That way we can see like what you thought about the whole thing, and then like what you thought about each like individual part.
Yeah, definitely. And I would definitely be interested in doing something like that. I think honestly,
That'd be
I've
awesome.
been doing a lot of response videos, and so review videos might be sort of a good addition to that as well. I want to at some point have like really in depth, pre-recorded videos, but I don't quite have the ability to do that yet. But I won't get too deep into that just because we're nearing the end of this.
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and take off. But yeah, I'd like to see that sometime maybe, and that would give definitely, instead of like kind of like a secondhand like somebody debating like his points or whatever, you can just like go by the text or whatever, and that, yeah, man. So I'll keep following, and hopefully see. I'll keep your stuff on notifications, that way I can see it in the future. But you guys take care, and I'm sure I'll talk to y'all again soon.
Good
Yeah,
night.
absolutely. I appreciate
God
the
bless, man.
conversation.
I'll see
You
you
have a
soon.
good rest of your day. God bless.
All right, you too. Bye.
All right, and is
Okay, so
go ahead.
but yeah, I guess with the ending of the show, now is a good time for me to say a couple of thoughts on this. And I certainly didn't mean to wait till Converse leaves to sort of get the last word on it, but that's just the order things went in. But I think it's ironic when people say that we read the text as 7 days because we're imposing science on it. Because specifically we inherited that view, and the scientific community tried to put a whole myth forward, which going into the science and data to learn about that's just a whole nother can of worms and huge rabbit hole, right? But the point is that as far as I can tell, the idea that it's not a literal 7 days, that only comes from our modern perspective, that 7 days seems unlikely. Or maybe to say it only comes from that is an exaggeration, because I think there were some ancient philosophers who had similar views, a minority of them. But that's the thing, is that it's modern science that has us thinking these can't be 7 literal days. These 7 days must be representing some other period of time. That's the imposition of science. That's when it's like, if we just take it as a historical text, we see it talks about days. It even says evening and morning, and it even tells us on day 4 what sets the length of a day. And I would encourage everyone, if someone tries to talk about how it's not a science text, don't let them get away with that, because that's a complete red herring. It's a historical text, and it's normal for history to talk about when things happened. Not only that, but it's also the creation account of the creator God. And so if that's only accounting for ordering creation that was already here, we know he created the creation that's already here, so that would mean that that's not the creation account at all. It's just a completely different account. And I don't think that's what the text is doing. I think the text is God expressing that this is his creation account as the creator God. And I really just go with the text, And that brings me to my last point, which is always my last point, of just trust Messiah. And that's that my experience is when we're new to the trust, when we're new to trusting Messiah, then there's a lot of confusion about it. But if our trust is first and foremost in him, then we can trust him, and the Spirit of truth will guide us into all truth. And, after living in that for a while, I now see that the text is actually rather straightforward and easy to understand. I've done maybe not a huge quantity of research in the Hebrew, but what I have done is have been extremely careful and deep. And I've spent a few years practicing how to study Hebrew and all of that. So I'm not a novice. I'm not a complete novice at it anymore. And there's only a few spots where I'm like, there's a problem with this word, you know? Like when it says, of behemoth, the sinew of his stones are stitched together. The actual text says the sinew of his terror are stitched together. And when it says terror, it's calling his tail a terror because it's a weapon. And the text is very clear, but of course the King James refers to it as stones, referring to testicles. But if you look up that word, it clearly means terror. It's in the Bible 75 times. And yeah. But if you just, if I may finish, but if you just look up that word through Strong's Concordance, it'll actually tell you it's only used once right there as stones, right? But then if you actually look at the spelling of the word, it's actually the exact same as another word that's used 75 times. And so even that, you have to be good at studying to dig in. But, well, I'll let you respond, Jamie, and then I'll wrap up what I'm saying here.
Oh, thanks. So the word is stone. So when it's used elsewhere, is that what you're saying? It's used as a literal stone, and so you have to make the connection.
No, it's not a stone. It's
Okay,
the word.
no.
It's the word terror. So it literally says the sinews of his terror are stitched together.
But isn't that the part that's not the stones? It's the tail, or people are trying to. It's the genitals.
No. I mean, I'll just go there and read it real quick so I can clarify, because I think you're hearing what I'm saying and then you're doubting that I'm saying it. It might just be that you don't have the text memorized quite as well.
That's probably right.
So it says, he moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his terror are wrapped together. But in this translation, it doesn't say terror, it says stones. But stones is just incorrect.
Gotcha.
And so I know KJV only people are going to be bitter if I say stones is incorrect, but the word means terror, and in context it's clearly a reference to his tail. It's a brontosaur, and its tail is its weapon.
Yeah, I was just thinking how I've been hearing this argument where people are saying it's referring to his penis. So you heard that? The tail is not.
Yeah, and that's an argument that IP makes. IP, who subscribes to Walton, and we've been talking about Walton a lot. So IP argues that because pagan religions have these chaos motifs that are really vulgar, with vulgarities of genitalia and all that, that therefore the section about a brontosaur's tail, and he's saying that the section about a brontosaur's tail, a tail is a penis, and the terror is his testicles, apparently. And if you actually look in the Strong's Concordance, and it says why they translate it as stones, it says as per embarrassment or shame. So the idea, I guess, is that the behemoth was ashamed that we could see his stones, and so they used the word terror to represent testicles. It's just an extremely horrible way to read the text. The text is just about a brontosaur's tail, and the terror of his sinews are stitched together. So yeah, I mean, I've heard that theory. It's just absolutely terrible. I don't know if Walton subscribes to such a thing, but if it does, then it's not worth reading his books, because that's just laughable garbage.
If you know it's not a dinosaur, I guess you'd have to come up with something.
Yeah, exactly. But the text, I mean, even not imposing that it must be a dinosaur, it does say he moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his terror are wrapped together. It's very explicitly describing a brontosaur. It's, I think, the most explicit description of an organism, in the entire. It's one of the most explicit descriptions in the entire Bible. So, but it's definitely not a chaos deity or anything. That's not even a valid thing to entertain. There's just no basis to entertain it. You would have to be. I mean, we know from the Bible, and we trust the Bible, we know that God specifically set Israel in contrast and opposition to the surrounding cultures. So there is some extent to where the context of how people communicated at that time is helpful. But what's not helpful is the context of what other people believed. Because God is very blatant that the pagans are wrong. So what the pagans believe has zero bearing on what the Bible is saying.
Did you see my video that I put out today?
No.
Okay, I didn't think so. I actually put out, I think it's just the only video on my channel, but it's about, I believe in soul sleep, so I was responding to Dr. Heiser speaking out, saying it wasn't a valid view, which I found shocking because he entertains
He said it wasn't a what view? I just didn't hear you.
Well, he doesn't give any. Often he'll give caveats for multiple views and why people believe them, kind of like showing both sides. But he didn't do that in this case with my view, which is soul sleep. He was saying it in the arguments that he was using. I thought were very poor, and I kind of railed on this idea about the ancient Near East context, which I accept. But
I'm really sorry, Jamie. It keeps like getting hard to hear right when I'm trying to find out exactly what you're saying. Are you saying that he's like against the soul sleep doctrine altogether, or that he's okay with it?
No, he's against it, and he didn't give any reasons why people hold it, which I thought was funny because I think people should at least consider it a valid possibility or something. Especially coming from him, he usually does that, is what I was saying. So I did a response video, and I was saying exactly what you were saying about the ancient Near East. Like, we can't ignore it, and it has influence, and it would just be unintelligent to ignore that or pretend like it doesn't exist. But the way he was applying it seemed like a very good example of over application. He was saying stuff like all the surrounding cultures didn't know anything about soul sleep, therefore the Bible isn't saying that. And I'm just thinking, that's ridiculous. That's a ridiculous argument. Just because no one else around them believed in soul sleep, so it couldn't be saying that. I just think that was an example. Whether it's true or not, the point is he was suggesting, it seems, that it couldn't be true because none of the cultures believed it around the Israelites, and I thought that was weird. It was a weird way to use it.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that, Jamie, you saying that, because that's really key to notice. Yeah, and academics, they have a lot invested in academia, and so we've got to be very careful. Like, people have mixed motives, right? And so that's one reason why I try to keep the way I get invested in what I'm doing. I try to have it like not potentially compromise my simple trust in Messiah, you know. But yeah, I do think that in the case of Michael Heiser, he has formed his awareness and identity, including all this academia, and if a lot of that academia is a lot less relevant than he has thought it is, then that's going to really chip away at how relevant he is and his identity and stuff. And I'm not trying to like get on him like he's totally all ego or something like that. But these are subtle spiritual influences, and it's worth noting that a lot of time people have an invested stake in not letting go of certain ideas, and that goes both ways. So yeah, when I see the over application of the Near East stuff, it seems to me like that's what keeps that Near East information so relevant. And so at least, you know, naturally, emotionally, from one's own ego, Michael Heiser would be resistant to putting less stake in those.
Yeah, I like Dr. Heiser, and I appreciate a lot of the things he says and has to teach, and I've learned from him. I just had to respond. Anyways, I put it in the link in the private chat. I'd love to hear what either of you guys think about, if you agree with me on the point I just made or not, or if I'm missing something. Or
oh, cool. And that's your channel, so now I'll be able to subscribe to your channel easily, too.
Yeah, I got to subscribe to yours, man. I just keep forgetting, and I'm going to do it right now.
Speaking of stuff like that, just so you guys know, the first episode of The Watchdog on the new channel was yesterday, and tomorrow we'll be going again, so it is officially on.
Oh, cool. I don't think YouTube
Sweet.
gave me the notice. I don't know if I haven't hit the bell correctly or if it's just because I've never watched that channel before.
Can you put it in the chat so I make sure I have it on my subscription list?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you should drop
definitely.
it in the live chat for everybody, CJ, while you're mentioning it.
Absolutely, that's actually a good idea. Let me go ahead
Yeah.
and do that.
Anybody out there, like and subscribe for sure.
Yeah, and so the channel I'm going to drop in here, and I appreciate you guys. The channel I'm going to drop in here now is my political channel. If anybody's interested in my political podcast, we don't talk apologetics over there. We talk politics and news, but it is still from a decidedly Christian bent, although of course conservative as well, but decidedly Christian conservative.
Yeah, and if I may also talk CJ up here, CJ really grew up keeping up with all these current events, and not just on a merely mainstream level, but more on like looking past just the mainstream to the actual available information. And then he's grown up to bring that forth into an absolutely biblical and Christian worldview, and he's now maturing to bring all that together and stuff. So he's really the best person for a Christian political news show. When I say the best person, I mean I don't know of any, well-known Christian that I've never met or anything. I don't know of anyone else who is as well suited for it as CJ. So I highly recommend, if you're only going to watch one news thing to keep up on important things for like Christianity and the prophetic trajectory of the world and that kind of thing. And not that CJ's putting forth theories about that, but he's just following stuff that totally seems to be related to that, and talking about how it relates and stuff. So as far as Christian news, I specifically recommend CJ, and he's my only recommendation for that.
Yep, and he's one of the very few people that I am willing to support financially, at least at this time, because I think he's honest, and I see a lot of potential, and he's already fully capable. So just want to say that that garners my support, and continue to do that.
And CJ's only one of 3 Christian YouTubers who has my full support. I say full because, I'm not saying I'm totally against everyone besides those 3, but as far as like, okay, through and through, I'm like satisfied with how this channel's doing their Christian thing, It's like, CJ's one of only 3 people who has my...
3 for me too. That's funny. I'm not surprised. You always say things I agree with completely. So.
Yeah. Well, one of my 3 is Emery. That is in his image. So I'm guessing that one's a different person for each of us, maybe. I'm not sure if you know Emery yet.
Yeah, I know of it.
I was just going to say I appreciate you guys, like, very much so, and want to say that all glory definitely goes to God, but I certainly appreciate you a lot.
Well, we appreciate you too, CJ. I appreciate you so very much, and it's nice that you've been like close enough with me to see both my mistakes and to see the obvious motivations behind them, and like the process of God correcting me and stuff. And it's just really nice to have one brother who's well aware and understands, and not only that, but like someone who's so straight up Christian and uncompromised, because that's the only person I really want to understand me. If someone's compromised, then I would hope that they don't quite understand me.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely understand that actually completely, because I have a similar view. Right, there's so many false believers out there, and there's so many confused believers too, right, who are genuine but are just so horribly off base.
I agree, and then that goes back into what I was saying about trust. That in my experience, even though it was very confusing at first, and I went through, hundreds of teachers, I mean, some of them maybe only a tiny bit, but at least many dozens of teachers, right? At least 100. And just like testing them, testing their teachings, testing all sorts of teachings and stuff, and doing that for some years. But now that trust has carried me forward, and I think it's John chapter 16 where Jesus tells the apostles, yeah, he tells the apostles that that the Spirit of truth, when he comes, will guide them into all truth. He will take what is mine and give to you. All that the Father has is mine. That is why I tell you he will give mine to you. So why does he tell us he will give his to us? Because all that the Father has is his. He's saying my whole point is that the Holy Spirit's going to give you all that the Father has. Or the Spirit of truth is going to give you all that the Father has. And that promise is the only reason I could make any progress. I had come to a point where God had broken me. I could not trust myself. I could not trust other people. And it was like, if I can't trust myself, then how can I trust me testing if I'm learning correctly, right? But when he promised the Spirit of truth would guide me into all truth, then I realized, like, okay, if I really just keep putting all of my trust in God, putting all of my trust in Jesus, and I keep myself out of the way, I can be really patient, I can be inconclusive for many months on things that I really want a conclusion on, but I just don't know, so I gotta wait until the Spirit reveals it, right? But with that promise, I trust Jesus, so I trusted that promise. And that promise is just crazy, right? Like that the Spirit of truth is going to show me all that the Father has. Like, that is a crazy, way too big promise. If I was to think that of myself, I'd be like some egomaniacal, what's that word? Arrogant. I'd be like super arrogant in this and that, right? But if Jesus says it, I trust it. But I also know that that's not a justification for me to pretend my own mind is the Spirit of truth, so I have to keep myself out of the way. But point being, I trusted that promise, and so as the Spirit of truth was guiding me, I had this trust that I was able to say, okay, this really is happening, despite the devil not wanting me to know, you know? And it's very much like a learning process. The Spirit of truth is the Spirit of truth. You learn by honesty and review and truth and testing and stuff. And that's very biblical. The New Testament's very holistic about this. So yeah, I think when we do just trust Messiah, then over time, if we just trust Messiah, right? Like if we have divided trust, then we're not necessarily going to get to the exact right place. But if we just trust Messiah and him only, and everything else has to be filtered through that, you know, then I find that the Bible is pretty easy to interpret. We don't actually like need to be concerned about the confusion of people like Mike Heiser and John Walton and stuff, because we do have the clarity, and we don't only have the clarity as individuals, we have the clarity as a body. Sort of like this woke church stuff with Marxism coming into the church, right? Some people would say that like now Christianity is divided, but it's not divided. Christianity has a consensus that woke church is wrong. You know, Christianity knows, for instance, that the Gospel Coalition is not a Christian ministry. That is a Marxist ministry, or it's a secular ministry. The whole point is to infiltrate Christianity. It's very obvious. But, and there's plenty of people who are not aware of the consensus of the body because they're not that part of the body. But the body does have an agreement. The body is one body in one Christ, one Lord, and we do have one agreement. Now, that doesn't mean that because I'm in the body, I agree with the body in every way, but the body does know better. And so, and Jesus has given us each other for that. It's a beautiful thing. And that's why spiritual discernment's important, because if we want to be polite and pretend that everyone who claims the name of Christ is Christian, then we're getting really confused about Christianity. Like, Christianity's clear. We do know what it is, and we do know what it teaches. And I think it's really important that we trust Messiah and accept that it's clear and that we know what it teaches, and to let politeness completely corrupt that and to entertain that the Spirit of truth is maybe just has us at this confused place and stuff. And if that were true, that'd be one thing, but it's just not true. We do have clarity on a matter such as young Earth creation. The body does have one consensus on that. It's not a divided issue. And I think sometimes it's more about, sometimes we have to discern what's Christian and what's not. Not necessarily who's Christian and who's not, but rather than saying maybe that's Christian when we should know better, we got to trust God and actually know better. But yeah, I do think that when we just trust Messiah, it does become very simple, and hopefully over the next couple years, I can help share that so other people can maybe access it better and more directly. But so just trust Messiah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then so I will go ahead and say to close this out is I appreciate you guys all being here today. I appreciate everybody who decided to show up. Had a really good conversation here today. It went almost 3 hours, it looks like, but these open rooms do tend to go pretty long, so I'm definitely not worried about that. If you guys did like this content, please consider liking and sharing this video. Also, please consider subscribing here to the Synagogue. We have pretty randomly Un-Apologetics episodes up frequently, often open rooms, often interviews, often just general discussions, sometimes going pretty in-depth. We're going to get very solid and streamlined here soon, but I have to get other things streamlined before I can get this streamlined and everything scheduled. Nonetheless, we also do debates, do post debates here, like I said. And I do also have a political channel called the Synagogue News that you guys can subscribe to if you find that interesting as well. Also, if you are a big fan of this content and think that I deserve to make it into a career of some kind, which is what I aim to do, you can actually go to my Patreon, which I did provide the link for in the live chat there, and contribute anything which you like. I don't have any tiers, so it can be as little or as much as you decide to choose. And of course, please only do so if you feel led. And remember, of course, that we want to do all things to the glory of God and for God's glory.
Oh wait, before you totally do your outro, I'm really sorry, but Converse did make a comment to me that I'd like to respond to. I didn't see it before, but
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Because I was talking about people being invested in their academia and their identity, and he said, Nicholas, you seem really invested too. And maybe that was before I explained. Maybe he typed that just before the moment when I explained that how I'm invested in making sure that I stay out of the way, and I just trust Messiah, and I just trust the Spirit of truth. And I'm invested in the importance of the trustworthy of Messiah, and I'm invested in letting God, through his text, teach me, and I'm invested in carefully testing any claims that may be different from the Bible and not being led astray, So, so I am really invested, but I try to be really careful what I'm invested in. And maybe I already expressed that, but I just, I wanted to respond to it and clarify that, my awareness of the fact that I have an ego that could be invested in my identity, and that could cause me to not be fully honest in all things. That awareness is important so that I may be on guard against that, so that I do my best to not let how I identify influence how I test for truth. So, sorry to interrupt, CJ. Awesome. I'll stop.
That's certainly all right. And I'll just say we might be on again tomorrow. I'm not 100% sure. I do have some things I want to announce, actually. It's kind of good that I ended up stopping because there's some things I forgot to announce that I do need to announce. Number one, I want to remind you guys, July 1st, we'll be on the Gospel Truth for the first time, debating Robert Rowe on the subject as to whether or not the Bible teaches a global flood. So definitely look forward to that. That's July 1st on the Gospel Truth. And I'll also be on Standing for Truth's channel for the first time, That I think we have that set for May the 13th, which is a Thursday, at about 1 p.m. Mountain Time. That'll be between me and Michael the Canadian Atheist on whether or not the 10 Commandments were ethical, or are ethical, I should say. And then lastly, we don't have the date set in stone, but we do know that it's going to happen, Lord willing. And that is a debate between a tag team of me and S.J. Thomason on Modern Day Debate versus a tag team of Danny from Phil Talk and Nathan from Digital Gnosis. So those will be incredibly interesting if they end up happening. So definitely look forward to any of that. And just want to say lastly that we want to give all glory to God. Thank you guys very much for being here. And if the Lord tarries, we will see you soon.
Amen.